Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't believe what happened to me last month. I've been debating whether to share this at all, but I need to tell someone who might actually believe me, because my family certainly doesn't. I'm a 54-year-old doctor from Boston. After my divorce finalized last year, 27 years of marriage down the drain, I've been trying to find myself again. My sister Elaine works for an international pharmaceutical company and travels frequently. When she mentioned she needed to visit their French office for a week, I jumped at the chance to tag along. My kids are grown, my practice has other physicians who could cover, and frankly, I needed a break from everything familiar. We flew into Paris, then rented a car to drive to this tiny village in Normandy. Honestly, it was so small I can't even remember the name. The countryside was exactly what you'd imagine. Rolling hills, stone walls, ancient churches. Picture perfect. Elaine would be working during the days, but I'd have time to explore and maybe do some hiking. I've always been the outdoorsy one between us. We arrived at our Airbnb around 4 in the afternoon. It was this charming stone cottage with blue shutters, surrounded by gardens. The jet lag was hitting me hard though. You know that weird, floaty feeling where you're exhausted but also weirdly wired? That was me. Our host, Pierre, was an older man, probably in his 70s, with that classic French countryside look. Weathered face, kind eyes, worn clothing that had seen years of work. After showing us around the cottage, I asked Pierre about walking paths nearby. I figured a good walk would help me adjust to the time difference, and maybe I'd actually sleep that night instead of staring at the ceiling until dawn. His reaction was odd. He stiffened a bit and glanced at the window. It was early May, so the sun wouldn't set until around 9, but it was already getting dimmer outside. He asked in broken English if I could wait until morning. When I pressed for why, he muttered something about locals don't go into the woods after dark. I laughed it off as superstition, but he didn't smile back. Is there something dangerous? Bears? I asked, thinking maybe there were legitimate wildlife concerns. Non, not bears, he said, waving his hand dismissively. Just, the people here, we respect the forest boundaries. At night, we stay away. I promised I wouldn't go far and would return before full dark. He sighed, clearly uncomfortable, but gave me directions to a path that started about half a mile down the road. As he was explaining, I noticed something I hadn't when we arrived. His property had multiple rows of fencing separating it from the forest edge. Not just one fence, but 3 separate barriers, each about 6 feet tall. At the time, I assumed it was for livestock or to keep deer out of his garden. Elaine was already on her laptop dealing with work emails, so I changed into comfortable shoes, grabbed a light jacket, and headed out. I took my phone for the flashlight feature just in case. The countryside was peaceful, birds singing, distant sheep bleating, the occasional car passing on the main road. After walking about 10 minutes, I found the path Pierre had described. The entrance to the forest was marked by an old wooden sign with faded French writing. My high school French was rusty, but I could make out chemin de something. The path itself was well maintained, not overgrown, which suggested people did use it regularly, despite Pierre's warnings. As I entered the forest, I was immediately struck by how beautiful it was. Ancient trees formed a canopy overhead, and the late afternoon sun filtered through in golden streams. The ground was carpeted with wildflowers and ferns. But the most unusual feature was the benches. Every 50 yards or so along the path, there was a handcrafted wooden bench. Each one was painted in bright colors and decorated with intricate designs, mostly fairies, flowers, and woodland creatures. Some had what looked like offerings placed on them, small bundles of flowers, polished stones, even tiny bowls of what might have been honey or milk. It reminded me of something from a storybook. I followed the green-benched path deeper into the forest. The light was beginning to fade, but I wasn't concerned yet. I could still see clearly enough, and the path was well marked. After walking for maybe 20 minutes, I came to a small clearing with a particularly elaborate bench. This one was larger than the others, carved with scenes of forests and mountains, and painted in shades of deep green and gold. I sat down to rest and take in the surroundings. That's when I first heard it. Initially, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but there was no breeze. The sound was hard to describe. Part human, like someone talking at a distance, but also part animal. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It wasn't threatening, just strange, and definitely not a sound I could attribute to any animal I knew. I stood up, suddenly aware that the forest had grown much darker in the short time I'd been sitting. The sun must have dipped below the horizon, and twilight was setting in fast. I turned on my phone's flashlight and decided it was time to head back. That's when the banging started. At first it was distant, a heavy rhythmic sound like someone hitting a tree with a bat. Thump, thump, thump. Then came crashing noises, as if something large was moving through the underbrush, breaking branches as it went. The sounds were getting closer. My heart rate spiked. I swept my flashlight beam around the clearing, trying to locate the source of the noise. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But the sounds continued, now seeming to come from multiple directions. Whatever was making them was big. The crashes suggested something moving with considerable force. I took a step back toward the path I'd come from, and my light caught something reflective in the trees. Two bright yellow eyes, about 7 feet off the ground, glowing in the beam. As soon as my light hit them, they blinked and disappeared, followed by an angry, guttural growl that made the hair on my arms stand up. Every instinct told me to run, but I was frozen in place. I've always been too curious for my own good. It's why I became a doctor. Instead of fleeing, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds, birds, insects, had stopped. Then the trees about 20 yards to my right shook violently, and something stepped into the dim edge of my flashlight beam. I still struggled to describe what I saw. It was massive, at least 12 feet tall, standing mostly upright but leaning forward slightly. The creature's arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its ankles. Its body was covered in dark brown hair or fur, thick and matted in places. The face, God, the face is what I remember most clearly. It wasn't entirely covered in hair. The facial features were visible, surrounded by what looked like a wild mane. The eyes were deep-set and intelligent, the jaw prominent with an underbite that revealed large, human-like teeth when it opened its mouth to let out a low, warning roar. I raised my light higher to see it better, which was a mistake. The creature immediately began what I can only describe as a display of aggression, slamming its massive hands against nearby trees, shaking them violently. One tree, which must have been at least 8 inches in diameter, bent alarmingly under the impact. The creature never moved from its spot, but demonstrated an extraordinary reach. Then I realized something even more terrifying. There were more of them. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could hear movement in the trees around the clearing, and occasional vocalizations, low rumbles, and what sounded almost like words, but in no language I recognized. I lowered my light and said as calmly as I could manage, with my voice shaking, "I'm sorry for disturbing you. I'm leaving now." I don't know why I thought talking would help, but it seemed like the right thing to do. The creature made a noise that sounded almost like disgust, a huffing, dismissive sound, and then, with surprising agility for something so large, it simply disappeared back into the forest. One moment it was there, the next gone, with barely a sound to mark its departure. I didn't wait around. I turned and walked as quickly as I could without running back the way I'd come. The entire time, I felt watched. Occasionally, I'd hear movement parallel to my path, always just out of sight in the trees. Once, I heard what sounded like a low, rumbling laugh. When I finally emerged from the forest, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool evening air. I practically ran the half-mile back to the cottage. Pierre was waiting outside when I arrived, pacing nervously. One look at my face, and he knew. He started speaking rapidly in French, too fast for me to understand. He ushered me inside, sat me down at the kitchen table, and poured a large glass of dark amber liquor that burned all the way down, but helped steady my nerves. When I told him what I'd seen, he flew into a rage. Not at me exactly, but at the situation. He made several frantic phone calls, his voice rising and falling in agitated French. Within 30 minutes, 3 older men from the village had arrived, all speaking over each other and gesturing wildly. Elaine came downstairs, confused by the commotion. She speaks much better French than I do, and began translating bits of the conversation. Apparently, the village had some kind of arrangement, a set of traditions they followed to keep them away from populated areas. By entering the forest at twilight, I had violated some boundary. The villagers were concerned this would be seen as a provocation. The most disturbing part came when one of the men demanded we leave immediately. Elaine explained that they believed the creatures followed people who had seen them, that they would track us back to the village and bring misfortune. Pierre argued for us to stay, saying something about protective rituals they could perform. In the end, we stayed, but the atmosphere was tense. Pierre insisted on hanging strange bundles of herbs over all the doors and windows, and the men didn't leave until after midnight. The rest of our week passed without incident. I tried to learn more about what I'd seen, but the locals clammed up whenever I brought it up. Even Pierre, who had been so forthcoming that first night, would only shake his head and make a gesture like he was warding off evil. I went back to those woods twice more during daylight hours, but saw nothing unusual except for the benches. I noticed on my second visit that each bench was painted a specific color, creating different paths through the forest. I followed the green path that first night, but there were also red, blue, and yellow paths branching off in different directions. Whatever I encountered that night, I'm certain it wasn't a bear or any known animal. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in North America, but never expected to encounter something similar in France. I later learned that many European countries have their own versions of wild forest beings, different names, but similar descriptions. I still have nightmares about those yellow eyes and that roar. Sometimes I wake up convinced something large is moving outside my bedroom window, even though I'm back in Boston now. Elaine tells me it was just stress and jet lag playing tricks on my mind, but I know what I saw. Story 2. I've never shared this with anyone outside my immediate family. Even now, nearly 50 years later, my hands shake as I type this. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those screams echo through my bedroom. I know how this sounds, I know what people will think, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. It was February of '74 when my wife Hilda, our 6-month-old son Michael, and I moved into that cabin in Los Angeles County. I was 32 at the time, Hilda 29. We'd saved enough from my construction job to get away from the city, find somewhere peaceful to raise our boy. The cabin was cheap, too cheap looking back, nestled against the San Gabriel Mountains, surrounded by pine trees and about a mile from the nearest neighbor. The first week was perfect, quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, Hilda humming as she hung laundry on the line, Michael cooing in his bassinet, our German shepherd Rex exploring every inch of our 5 acres. I remember thinking we'd found paradise, until Michael started screaming. Not normal baby cries, These were primal, terrified shrieks that would start the second we put him in his crib by the north-facing window. The first time it happened, Hilda and I nearly tripped over each other running to him. His little face was red, tears streaming, tiny fists balled up. Nothing would calm him until we moved him away from that window. "Maybe he doesn't like the draft," Hilda suggested, but there wasn't any draft. We tried again the next night. Same thing. Absolute hysterics. We moved his crib to our bedroom after that, but that was just the beginning. 3 nights later, around 9 in the evening, Rex started acting strange. He'd been dozing by the fireplace when suddenly his head snapped up, ears forward. He ran to the door and started whining, scratching frantically. "Probably a raccoon," I told Hilda. But when I opened the door to check, Rex bolted into the darkness. I called after him, flashlight sweeping the tree line, but he was gone. "He'll come back when he's hungry," I assured Hilda, though something felt wrong. Rex was well trained, never ran off. I woke at dawn to Hilda shaking me, her face pale. "Rex hasn't come back," she whispered, "and I heard something outside all night, like scratching." I spent that morning calling for him, hiking through the surrounding woods. It was nearly noon when I found him, or what was left of him, by the water tank about 400 yards from our cabin. I'll never forget the sight. Rex had been torn apart, his body in pieces, not like a coyote or mountain lion kill where they eat what they want and leave the rest. This was deliberate, methodical. His legs were separated from his body, laid out in a strange pattern. His head was missing. I vomited right there, then covered what remained with my jacket. I couldn't let Hilda see him like that. When I got back to the cabin, she was standing on the porch, clutching Michael. "Did you find him?" she asked. I shook my head, told her I'd found tracks leading toward the highway, that he must have run off. It was the first of many lies I'd tell to try to protect her. That night, we heard it for the first time, a scream that started low and built to a pitch that made the windows vibrate. It sounded like a woman being murdered, but wrong somehow, too guttural, too primal. Hilda clutched my arm so tight she left bruises. "What was that?" she whispered. "Mountain lion," I said, another lie. I'd grown up hunting with my dad in these mountains. I knew every sound local wildlife made. This was something else entirely. The next morning I went fishing at the creek about half a mile from our property. Caught a good string of trout, enough for several meals. I remember being proud, thinking this was why we'd moved here, to live off the land. I strung them up on a high branch of the telephone pole near our driveway, about 12 feet up. No way anything could reach them there. I planned to clean them after lunch. When I came back 2 hours later, they were gone. The string was still there, hanging empty. No blood, no scales, nothing to suggest. What had taken them? Just gone. From 12 feet in the air. I told myself it must have been a particularly ambitious bear, though there was no sign of claw marks on the pole. That evening, as the sun set, I noticed them. Footprints circling our cabin, 3-toed prints, massive, at least 16 inches long. They were pressed deep into the mud from the recent rain, suggesting whatever made them was heavy, really heavy. I didn't tell Hilda. Instead, I loaded my hunting rifle and kept it by the door. We went to bed early, Michael between us in our bed. I pretended to sleep, but kept my eyes on the window, watching, waiting. Around 2 in the morning, the screams started again, closer this time. Then another answered from the opposite direction. Then another. We were surrounded by those awful screams. Michael started crying, and Hilda was shaking. "Andrew, what is that?" she pleaded. Before I could answer, something hit our cabin wall with such force that a framed picture fell and shattered. Then another impact, harder, on the other side. Whatever was out there was circling us, testing the structure. I grabbed the rifle and told Hilda to take Michael into the bathroom, the only room without windows, and lock the door. As she ran, there was a tremendous crash against our front door. Not like something running into it, but like something deliberately throwing its weight against it. The door held, but just barely. Through the window beside it, I caught a glimpse of something moving back into the tree line. Something tall, walking on two legs, but hunched over. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human either. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. At first light, I went outside, rifle ready. The footprints were everywhere now, and there was coarse, dirty white hair stuck to the splintered wood of our porch. It smelled awful, like a combination of wet goat and possum urine, but stronger, more pungent. I followed one set of tracks to the edge of our clearing before losing them in, the rocky terrain. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw a rock the size of a basketball come sailing out of the trees, landing with a thud on our roof. Then another, from a different direction. I ran back inside, bolted the door. Hilda was sitting at the kitchen table, Michael clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "We need to leave," she said. I shook my head. We sank everything into this place. Where would we go? Another week passed. The incidents continued. Rocks on the roof at night, screams in the darkness, footprints around the cabin. I set up a camera on the porch, hoping to capture whatever was tormenting us. The first 2 nights, nothing. The third night, the camera was smashed to pieces. On the 10th day after Rex disappeared, I was chopping wood near the shed when I felt it. That feeling of being watched. The hair on my neck stood up, and I slowly turned toward the tree line. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It was standing just within the shadows, tall, at least 7 feet, with a massive barrel-shaped torso. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands with fingers that seemed too long. But it was the face that haunts me still, deep-set eyes that reflected the sunlight like a cat's, a flat, almost non-existent nose, and its hair, stringy, matted, a dirty white color like old snow. For what felt like eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then its lips pulled back, revealing yellowed teeth, and it let out a low rumble that I felt in my chest. I raised the axe instinctively. It tilted its head, almost curiously, then took a step forward. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran for the cabin, hearing heavy footfalls behind me. I made it inside, slammed the door, and wedged a chair under the handle. Hilda found me there, white as a sheet. "What happened?" she demanded. I told her everything about Rex, about what I'd seen. As I spoke, her eyes widened, and she clutched Michael tighter. "There's more than one," she whispered. "I've seen them from the bedroom window, 3 of them. One is female. It has breasts." She shuddered at the memory. That night was the worst. They surrounded the cabin just after sunset. We could hear them moving around, communing with each other in grunts and those terrible screams. One slammed into the bathroom window so hard the glass cracked. Another pounded on the roof directly above our bedroom. I fired a warning shot through the window. There was a moment of silence, then an enraged howl that made my blood freeze. Something heavy hit the door, then again and again. The wood began to splinter. I pushed Hilda and Michael into the bedroom closet and stood guard with the rifle. The pounding stopped suddenly, replaced by a new sound, scraping on the roof. Then a thud on the porch, and another. They were on the roof, dropping rocks onto our porch. This continued for hours. By dawn, our porch was covered in rocks of various sizes. The creatures were gone, but they'd left their message. They could get to us any time they wanted. We packed essential items that morning and drove to the nearest town to call my brother from a payphone. He lived in San Diego and agreed to let us stay with him for a few days. As we drove away from the cabin, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. 3 figures standing at the edge of our clearing, watching us leave. We returned a week later with my brother and his hunting buddy, both armed. We found the cabin ransacked. Everything soft, pillows, mattresses, couch cushions, had been shredded. Food was gone from the pantry. Most disturbing were the claw marks dragged down the walls, some as high as 8 feet up. My brother and his friend stayed with us for another week. No sign of the creatures during that time. They decided we'd had a bear problem and helped us reinforce the doors and windows before leaving. The night after they left, the screams returned. This cycle continued for months. The creatures would harass us for days on end, then disappear for a week or two, then return. We installed floodlights around the property, which seemed to keep them at bay, but only when the lights were on. If the power flickered, they would approach immediately, as if they were constantly watching, waiting for an opportunity. One creature in particular, the female with large, pendulous breasts, would often stand just at the edge of the light, staring at our windows. Once, when I was alone in the kitchen, she approached closer than the others ever had, pressing her face against the window. Her eyes locked with mine, showing an intelligence that terrified me more than any of their physical attacks. In late August, after a particularly violent night where they nearly broke through our reinforced door, Hilda gave me an ultimatum. Either we leave, or I'm taking Michael and leaving without you. I knew she meant it. The next day, I put the cabin up for sale at a massive loss. We moved in with my parents in Pasadena while looking for a new place. We told everyone we'd had trouble with bears and coyotes, that the rural life wasn't for us with a young baby. No one would have believed the truth. We never went back to that cabin. A couple from Oregon bought it sight unseen as a summer home. Less than a year later, it was back on the market. I've sometimes wondered if they experienced what we did. I've researched obsessively over the years, looking for similar accounts. I've found some. Hikers in the San Gabriels reporting strange screams, three-toed footprints found near abandoned campsites, stories of rocks thrown at cars on remote roads. Locals call them the mountain devils. Scientists dismiss the accounts as bear encounters or hoaxes, but I know what I saw. I know what hunted my family for those terrible months in 1974. Sometimes I dream about the female creature's eyes staring through our window, and I wake up wondering if she's still out there in those mountains, waiting, watching, and if she remembers me too. Story 3. I still get chills typing this out. What happened 3 weeks ago has completely destroyed my sense of security, and I haven't slept properly since. I've debated whether to share this at all, but I need to tell someone who might believe me, because the police certainly didn't. I live with my mom in Oak Ridge, Georgia, a typical suburban neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happens. We've got the cookie-cutter houses, manicured lawns, and neighbors who wave but don't really talk to each other. Our house backs up to a small wooded area that separates our neighborhood from another development. Nothing special, just enough trees to give us privacy. On that night, I was up late gaming, just normal 20-something stuff. Mom had gone to bed around 10, and I was planning to crash around midnight but got caught up in one more match. It was about 2 in the morning when I finally shut everything down. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. A whistle. Not like a bird or the wind, but a deliberate human-sounding whistle. The kind someone might use to call a dog or get your attention. 2 distinct notes, high-low, repeated 3 times. At first I thought I was imagining things. It was the middle of the night, and my mind was probably just playing tricks after hours of gaming, but then it happened again, clear as day, coming from behind our house. I stepped out of the bathroom and listened. When it came a 3rd time, I went to the back window and peered through the blinds. Our backyard has a pool with this raised deck that sits about 8 feet off the ground. Dad built it years ago before he left us, making it tall because the yard slopes down. From the deck, you can see over the fence into the woods. The motion lights weren't on, which was weird because they're pretty sensitive. I couldn't see anything moving out. There, but that whistle came again, and it definitely wasn't coming from inside our yard. It was just beyond, in the trees. I was about to go back to bed, figuring it was just some drunk teenagers messing around in the woods, when Mom appeared in the hallway. "You hear that?" she whispered, tightening her robe around herself. "Yeah, sounds like it's coming from the woods." "Someone might be casing the house," she said, suddenly looking worried. Our neighborhood had a few break-ins the previous summer, and Mom never quite got over it. "We should check." I wanted to tell her we should just call the cops, but I knew she wouldn't go back to sleep without checking. Mom's not the type to hide under the covers, so I grabbed the big mag light from the kitchen drawer and we headed to the back door. The night was unusually quiet. No crickets, no distant traffic, just silence. The air felt heavy and thick, like right before a storm, but the sky was clear with a half moon, providing just enough light to see the outline of the trees. Mom flipped the switch for the back floodlights, but nothing happened. "Bulbs must be out," she muttered, sounding annoyed but not yet alarmed. We stepped out onto the patio, and I swept the flashlight beam across the yard. Everything looked normal. The pool cover was in place, the deck chairs stacked against the railing of the deck, the gate to the side yard closed. That's when the whistle came again, closer this time, definitely right at the edge of our property where our fence meets the tree line. "Hello?" Mom called out. "This is private property." Nothing, just silence. "I'm going to check the deck," I said, moving toward the steps. "Maybe we can see into the woods from up there." I got to the first step when I heard it. Movement in the underbrush beyond our fence. Not like an animal scurrying. This was heavier, deliberate, branches snapping, leaves crunching. Something big was moving, and it was moving toward us. Every instinct told me to run back inside, but I was frozen, 1 foot on the step, as the sounds got closer. "Mason," Mom whispered urgently, tugging at my sleeve. "Come back. Let's go inside." That broke my trance. I backed up, nearly tripping over myself. Whatever was out there was now right at our fence line. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that didn't sound right. Not human, not animal, just wrong. I raised the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. What I saw in that beam of light still haunts me every time I close my eyes. Standing behind our fence was something. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a really tall person on stilts. But no, this thing was massive. The top of our deck railing sits 8 feet high, and this creature stood at least 2 feet taller than that. 10 feet minimum, maybe more. But it wasn't just the height, it was everything else. Its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, torso too narrow. I couldn't make out details of its body because it seemed to blend with the darkness behind it, like it was wearing the night itself. But its face, God, its face. The eyes are what I remember most clearly. Huge, forward-facing eyes that caught my flashlight beam and reflected back a deep blood red. Not the yellow-green eyeshine you'd see in a deer or raccoon. This was different. A dull crimson glow that seemed to come from within rather than simple reflection. And those eyes held intelligence. That's what terrified me most. This wasn't some animal reacting on instinct. When I shined the light directly at its face, it turned its head slightly to avoid the direct beam while still keeping us in its sight. It was thinking, calculating. Mom's grip on my arm tightened so much it hurt. I heard her breath catch, a small whimper escaping her throat. For several seconds, though it felt like hours, we all just stood there locked in some horrific standoff. Us, paralyzed with fear. It, watching us with those terrible eyes. Then it moved, not lunging forward as I feared, but backing away, slowly, deliberately. One careful step at a time, never fully turning its back to us. Every few steps, it would pause and turn those glowing eyes back in our direction, as if checking whether we were following. "What the fuck is that?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice cracking. Mom just shook her head, unable to speak. The creature continued its retreat until it reached our neighbor's property line, where they have a small garden shed. It moved behind the shed, and for a moment I thought it was gone. Then slowly, I saw part of its head peek out from behind the structure, just enough for one of those eyes to watch us, waiting, observing. "We need to get inside," Mum finally said, her voice barely audible. "Now!" We backed toward the house, never turning away from where the creature was partially hidden. My hand fumbled blindly behind me for the door handle. When I found it, we practically fell inside, slamming and locking the door behind us. Mum immediately ran through the house, checking all the locks, closing blinds, while I stood at the back door, flashlight still aimed out the window, watching for any movement. "Should we call the police?" I asked when she returned. "And tell them what? That we saw a 10-foot-tall monster in our backyard?" She had a point. "Let's just stay inside, keep watch." We spent the rest of the night in the living room, lights on, jumping at every sound. I kept thinking about those eyes, that deliberate movement, the way it watched us, the intelligence behind its actions. When morning finally came, we ventured outside to look for evidence. The ground was too hard for footprints, and we found nothing except for some broken branches along the fence line. Mum called an electrician who discovered that the wires to our outdoor lights had been cut, not frayed or damaged, but cleanly severed. I'd been sleeping on the couch since then, facing the back door. Mum installed a security system 3 days later, but it doesn't make me feel any safer, because whatever that thing was, it wasn't some random animal or a person in a costume. It was something else, something that whistled to draw us out, something that deliberately disabled our lights, something that watched us with calculation and purpose. I don't know what it wanted or if it will come back, but I know what I saw, and I know that sound, that two-note whistle, will haunt me forever. Sometimes late at night I think I hear it again, distant but distinct, and I wonder if it's trying to call me out again, to finish whatever it started that night. But I won't go outside, I won't answer its call, because I can't shake the feeling that next time it won't just watch and retreat. Next time, it might decide to come closer. Story 4. I can't believe I'm finally writing this all down. I've been carrying this story for almost 10 years now, and honestly, I'm still not sure I fully understand what happened to us. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar and can help make sense of it. Or maybe writing it out will help me process it. All I know is that I can't keep it bottled up anymore. Back in 2013, my wife Emma and I bought what we thought was our dream home. A cabin on 10 acres in the mountains of West Virginia near Plum Orchard Lake. We'd always wanted to live somewhere peaceful, with plenty of space for our 2 kids. Jake was 7 and Lily was 5 at the time, to run around and explore. The property was perfect, beautiful woodland, with a small creek running through it, bordering thousands of acres of state forest. The cabin itself wasn't huge, but it was cozy and solid, with 3 bedrooms and a big stone fireplace. I remember standing on the back porch with Emma the day we moved in, looking out at all those trees, feeling like we'd finally made it. For the first few months, everything was exactly what we'd hoped for. The kids loved exploring the woods, always with one of us, of course. We set up bird feeders, planted a garden, and started renovating parts of the cabin. I work in IT and was able to do most of my job remotely, only driving into Charleston a couple times a month. Emma homeschooled the kids and sold handmade soaps online. It was the life we'd always dreamed about. About 6 months after we moved in, my old buddy Marcus came to visit for a weekend. He was going through a divorce and needed to get away. He fell in love with the property too, and half-jokingly mentioned wishing he could live there. I remembered there was this flat clearing about 100 yards from our cabin that would be perfect for a tiny house. One conversation led to another, and by the end of summer, Marcus had quit his job in Ohio, bought a prefab tiny house, and moved onto our property. We worked out a small rent arrangement, but honestly, I was just happy to have my best friend nearby. Emma liked having another adult around too, especially when I had to go into the office. Looking back, the weird stuff started happening not long after Marcus moved in. It was subtle at first, Marcus mentioned hearing something hitting the metal roof of his tiny house at night. We figured it was just acorns or small branches. There were a lot of oak trees around. But then one morning, he showed me several decent-sized rocks that he'd found scattered around his place. I remember joking that maybe the local kids were messing with the newcomer, but there weren't any neighbors close enough for that to make sense. Emma started saying she felt like she was being watched whenever she was outside, especially near dusk. I didn't take it seriously at first. City folks moving to the country often feel that way until they adjust. But then I started noticing things too. Bird feeders knocked over that had been securely mounted. Our trash cans tipped and scattered even though we'd started, using bungee cords to secure the lids because of raccoons. One morning, I found our garden hose unwound and stretched across the yard when I know I'd coiled it up the night before. By October, Marcus was reporting almost nightly disturbances, twigs, rocks, sometimes whole branches hitting his house. He installed motion-activated lights, thinking it might scare off whatever animals were causing the trouble. That's when things got worse. The lights would trigger, but when he'd look outside, there was nothing there. Yet the sounds would continue, tap, tap, tap against his walls and roof. As winter approached and the trees lost their leaves, we noticed what looked like game trails leading from the state forest to the creek behind our house. That wasn't surprising. Deer and other wildlife would naturally come to the water. But something felt off about these trails. They didn't look quite right to me, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The paths were wider than typical deer trails, and there were weird scrape marks on some of the trees along the way, too high up to be from deer rubbing their antlers. The night everything escalated was in early December. It had snowed lightly that day, and the temperature had dropped into the 20s. Around 11 at night, both our cabin and Marcus's tiny house started getting pelted with stones and rocks. Not just a few, it sounded like handfuls being thrown at once. The dogs, we had 2 labs and Marcus had a German shepherd, went absolutely ballistic, barking and growling at the windows. Marcus called us, and I grabbed my rifle while Emma stayed with the kids who had woken up scared. Marcus came over with his dog and his own gun. We decided to check it out, thinking maybe it was some local troublemakers. The dogs led us toward the creek, straining at their leashes and growling low in their throats in a way I'd never heard before. We found nothing but disturbed stones near the creek bed and a horrible smell, like rotting meat mixed with something musky and sour. The dogs were acting strange, whining and pulling in different directions. We followed the game trail for about 50 yards into the state forest, but turned back when we realized how foolish we were being, tracking something unknown in the dark woods. The next morning, I found large, strange depressions in the light snow near our woodpile. They weren't quite footprints, more like someone had pressed their hand down, but much bigger than a human hand. I took pictures, but convinced myself they were just weird melting patterns, or maybe where a deer had bedded down. 2 nights later, Marcus called at about 1 in the morning, his voice shaking. He said something had been manipulating his front door handle for the past hour, not just jiggling it, but actually turning it slowly back and forth. He'd pushed his couch against the door and was sitting there with his shotgun. I grabbed my rifle and headed over, but whatever had been there was gone by the time I arrived. His dog was hiding under his bed, trembling. We installed game cameras the next day, 2 near Marcus's place, 1 by our woodpile, and 1 facing the trail to the creek. I was determined to catch whatever animal was causing all this. The night that changed everything was December 15th. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week before we were supposed to drive to Emma's parents for Christmas. We'd gone to bed around 10, and I fell asleep quickly after a long day of work and cutting firewood. I woke to a sound that I can only describe as a deliberate boom against the side of our house, like someone had taken a battering ram to the wall. The whole cabin seemed to shake. The kids started crying immediately. Emma shot up in bed, clutching my arm so tight her nails broke my skin. Then it happened again. Boom! against the back wall this time. The dogs were going crazy, snarling and barking. A third boom hit the wall near our bedroom, and I swear I felt the foundation shift. I grabbed my rifle from the safe with shaking hands, while Emma gathered the kids into our room. I called Marcus, who was already awake and had heard the sounds from his place. He said he was coming over. I told Emma to lock the bedroom door and call 911 if she heard anything happen to me. Marcus arrived with his dog and shotgun about 3 minutes later. We stood in the living room, listening. Everything had gone quiet except for our dogs, who were now standing at the back door, hackles raised, making this awful low growling sound. "We need to check it out," Marcus whispered. "I know," I said, even though every instinct was screaming at me not to go outside. We put on our coats and boots, grabbed flashlights, and stepped onto the back porch, guns ready. The night was clear and cold, the quarter moon providing just enough light to see the outlines of the trees. Our breath clouded in front of us. The dogs suddenly bolted off the porch, barking and heading straight for the tree line near the path to the creek. We followed, calling them in harsh whispers, sweeping our flashlight beams ahead of us. The dogs stopped about 20 yards from the first line of trees, their barking shifting to a high-pitched whine I'd never heard them make before. That's when I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, partially hidden behind a large oak at the edge of the woods, was something that still haunts my dreams. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and broad, with dark, matted hair covering its body. But it was the eyes that made my blood turn to ice, glowing red in the reflection of the flashlight, staring directly at us with undeniable intelligence. For what felt like eternity, but was probably only seconds, none of us moved. The creature, Marcus, me, even the dogs. We all just froze in that moment of impossible reality. I could hear Marcus's breathing beside me, fast and shallow. My own heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then the thing moved. It didn't charge or run away. It simply took one deliberate step backward into the darkness of the forest, those red eyes never leaving us until the shadows swallowed it completely. "What the fuck was that?" Marcus's voice was barely audible. "I don't know," I managed to say. "We need to go back inside, now." We started backing away slowly, keeping our lights and guns pointed toward where the creature had been. We'd made it about halfway to the house when an ungodly sound shattered the night. A roar that was neither bear nor mountain lion, nor anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural, and somehow disturbingly human-like at its core, but twisted into something primal and terrifying. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran like hell back to the cabin, the dogs right alongside us. As we sprinted across the yard, I could hear something moving parallel to us, just inside the tree line, pacing us, branches snapping under its weight. It was following the ridge that ran along the edge of our property, staying just out of sight. We made it inside, locked every door and window, and huddled in the living room with the terrified kids and Emma. None of us slept that night. We kept the lights on and guns ready. Occasionally, we'd hear heavy movement outside, something circling the house, but never approaching directly. By morning, whatever it was had gone. In the daylight, we found evidence of its visit. 3 distinct impact points on the exterior walls, where something had struck with incredible force. One had actually cracked the wooden siding. Around the house were tracks in the frost-covered ground, similar to the ones I'd seen before, but clearer now. They were foot-shaped but wrong somehow, too large, with what looked like opposing thumbs on both sides. Marcus moved out that day. He packed essential belongings into his truck and left for his parents' house in Pennsylvania, not even bothering with the tiny house. Can't say I blame him. We stayed through Christmas only because we had nowhere else to go immediately, but we kept the kids inside and took turns keeping watch. I contacted a realtor in January, and by early March, we'd sold the property at a significant loss and moved back to the suburbs of Charleston. I've never told this story publicly before. Who would believe it? Sometimes I wake up convinced I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those eyes, that roar, and I know what we experienced was real. We never found out what was stalking us in those West Virginia mountains. Whatever it was, it drove us from our dream home and left me with a permanent unease around forests. I still can't bring myself to go camping or hiking, and the sound of something hitting the roof of our house during storms sends me into a panic. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching the new owners from the tree line waiting for darkness to fall. Story 5. I've been struggling with whether or not to post this for a long time. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this out. I'm not normally the type of person who believes in the unexplainable. I've always been the rational one in my friend group, the guy who finds the logical explanation for weird noises or strange shadows. But what happened near Camp Holiday 3 months ago has completely changed how I see the world, and I need to get this off my chest. My name is Oliver. I've been hiking and camping most of my life. Grew up doing it with my dad, then joined hiking groups in college, and now I try to get out into nature at least once a month. I'm pretty experienced in the outdoors. I know what animals sound like at night. I know what a bear looks like when it stands up. I know what a person looks like when they're walking through the woods. What I saw that night wasn't any of those things. I was with my buddies Danny and Tom on what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend trip. We'd been planning it for months, just a way to blow off some steam after a stressful period at work. Camp Holiday has these beautiful trails that follow along a small river, and we decided to take an evening hike since the weather was perfect. The moon was nearly full that night, lighting up the path so well we barely needed our flashlights. It was about 10 o'clock, and we were following what locals call the Golden Trail, named for how it looks when sunlight hits it in the fall, all covered in yellow leaves. The setup of this trail is important to understand what happened. To our left was the river, calm and reflecting the moonlight. To our right were thick woods. About 30 meters to our right, there was a raised embankment that led to another wooded area higher up. The trail itself was clear and well maintained. Nothing creepy about it during the day, and honestly, it didn't feel threatening that night either. There were other campers in the area, though not on the trail with us at that moment. We were just walking, talking about nothing important. Work stuff, sports, the usual. I remember feeling completely at ease. Then, for no particular reason, I glanced toward the river, and my eyes were drawn to movement on the embankment across from us. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it another hiker? Was it a bear? But within seconds, I knew it wasn't either of those things. The figure was moving along the top of the embankment, parallel to our path. It was walking upright, completely bipedal, but something about its gait was wrong. It swayed in a way humans don't. Its torso was disproportionately large and thin compared to what would be normal, and its legs were long. I'd estimate it stood about 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The thing that really struck me, though, the detail that still gives me chills, was how it casually reached up and snapped off a tree branch as it walked. It didn't pause or break stride, just reached up with one arm, grabbed a branch that had to be at least 8 feet off the ground, and snapped it clean off like it was nothing. The casual strength in that motion was terrifying. No human could do that, at least not so effortlessly. I froze in place, unable to speak or move. I was trying to process what I was seeing when Danny suddenly whispered, "Do you guys hear that?" That broke my trance. "Hear what?" I whispered back, still staring at the figure, which continued moving along the embankment. That clacking sound, like someone's hitting rocks together. Now I heard it too, a rhythmic clack, 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 coming from the direction I was staring. The sound wasn't synced with the creature's movements, which made it even more unsettling, like there might be more than one of them. "Guys," I finally managed to say, my voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" On the embankment? Tom squinted in the direction I was pointing. See what? There's something walking up there. It's huge. Danny looked where I was pointing and grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. Holy shit, he whispered. What the fuck is that? Tom still couldn't see it, but the fear in our voices was enough to convince him something was wrong. What are you guys seeing? He asked, his voice rising with panic. I described what I was seeing as precisely as I could. The height, the strange proportions, the casual way it had snapped that branch, the unnatural swaying walk. As I spoke, the figure disappeared into the tree line at the top of the embankment. Maybe it's just another camper? Tom suggested, but his voice betrayed his doubt. No way, Danny said. No fucking way. We stood there for a moment, frozen in indecision. Then Danny called out, "Hello? Anyone up there?" His voice echoed slightly, but there was no response, just that continuous clacking sound, which seemed to be moving away from us now. Someone would answer, I said quietly. This is Camp Holiday. People are friendly here, they'd call back. That realization sent a chill through all of us. Whatever was up there wasn't interested in communicating with us. We should go back, Tom said, already turning around. I nodded, and we started walking quickly back the way we'd come. None of us wanted to run. Running felt like it would trigger something primal, like it would mark us as prey, but we moved as fast as we could without breaking into a sprint. About half a mile back down the trail, there was a small grove of pine trees set back from the path. Without discussing it, we all veered toward it, seeking some kind of shelter or hiding place. We sat down in a tight circle, our backs to each other, scanning the darkness around us. What the fuck did we just see? Danny asked, his voice shaking. I don't know, I admitted. But it wasn't human, and it wasn't a bear or any animal I recognize. Could it have been a person on stilts? Tom suggested. Like playing a prank? I shook my head. No way. The movements were too fluid, and no person could snap a branch like that while walking, especially not on stilts. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, debating what to do. Our campsite was still another 2 miles ahead on the trail. Going back would mean a 5-mile hike to the nearest parking area. Neither option seemed appealing with that thing potentially out there. We could call for help, Tom suggested, pulling out his phone. No signal, he added after a moment. Of course there wasn't. There never is in horror movies, I thought hysterically. Except this wasn't a movie. This was happening to us right now. The clacking sound had stopped at least, but that didn't make me feel any better. Now we had no way of tracking where the thing might be. We sat in that pine grove for hours, speaking in whispers, jumping at every sound. The moon moved across the sky. By 1 in the morning we hadn't heard or seen anything unusual for a while, and we were getting cold just sitting there. Look, Danny finally said, we need to make a decision. Either we spend the night right here, freezing our asses off, or we continue to the campsite where we have our gear. What if that thing is still out there? Tom asked. Then it's had plenty of time to come after us already, Danny reasoned, and sitting here isn't making us any safer. He had a point. We couldn't stay in those pine trees forever. Let's arm ourselves, I suggested. Find some sticks, something to defend ourselves with if needed. We each found a large branch that could serve as a makeshift club. Danny also had a sheath knife he carried for camping, which he now held at the ready. It wasn't much, but it made us feel slightly less vulnerable. We set off again, walking 3 abreast down the trail, constantly scanning the woods around us. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every rustle of leaves made us freeze in place. The friendly, familiar trail now felt hostile and alien. The rest of the hike was the most tense experience of my life. We moved slowly, deliberately, trying to make as little noise as possible. No one spoke. We communicated with gestures and nods. The moonlight that had seemed so beautiful earlier now cast sinister shadows across the path. When we finally reached our campsite, we found everything undisturbed. Our tent was still standing. Our cooler was where we'd left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but none of us felt safe. "Should we pack up and leave?" Tom asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "And go where?" Danny countered. "Hike 5 more miles in the dark? What if we run into that thing again?" We decided to stay, but none of us slept. We sat in a circle around our lantern, weapons at the ready, talking in hushed voices about what I'd seen. "I've always thought Bigfoot was bullshit," Danny admitted, "but after tonight, I don't know anymore." I nodded. "Same. I've always been the skeptic, always looked for the rational explanation. But what I saw tonight," I trailed off, unable to find the words. "It wasn't human," I finally continued. "It wasn't an animal I recognize. It moved with purpose, with intelligence, and that casual display of strength." I shuddered at the memory. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up our gear and hiked out, not even bothering with breakfast. It had rained lightly during the early morning hours, washing away any tracks that might have been left on the trail. Part of me was disappointed. I wanted proof, something tangible to validate what I'd seen. But another part of me was relieved. Some things, once confirmed, can't be unlearned. We've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was a very tall person wearing some kind of costume. Maybe it was a bear that just looked strange in the moonlight. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw. And Danny heard that clacking sound, a sound that I later learned has been reported in connection with other Bigfoot sightings. It's a detail we didn't know at the time, which makes it harder to dismiss as imagination. I've been camping and hiking my entire life. I know the woods, I know the creatures that live there. What I saw that night near Camp Holiday doesn't fit into any category I'm familiar with. It's forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about what exists in our world. I haven't been back to those woods since that night. I'm not sure I ever will. The certainty I once had that the world is fully explored, fully understood, has been shattered. There are things out there we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you come face to face with them on a moonlit trail when you least expect it. Story 6. I still haven't fully processed what happened during our camping trip to Mount Graham last year. It's been almost a year since that Memorial Day weekend in 2013, and I find myself going over the details again and again, trying to make sense of it all. My husband, Miguel, thinks I should just let it go, but I can't. I need to share this somewhere because it's eating me up inside. We had been planning this trip for months, a chance to get away from Phoenix's pre-summer heat and celebrate our son Lucas's 11th birthday in nature. Our daughter Sophia, 12 at the time, was excited about camping with her cousins. Miguel's brother and his family had arrived at Cunningham Campground a day earlier to secure spots, so we joined them on May 25th. When we arrived around noon, the campground was pretty full, not surprising for a holiday weekend. We managed to get a decent spot near the restrooms, which seemed convenient at the time. Looking back, I wonder if being so close to that trail behind the facilities is what led to whatever happened. The first day was perfect. The weather was ideal, warm during the day but cool enough at night to appreciate a campfire. We set up our 6-person tent, took our 2 dogs for walks around the campground, and had a small birthday celebration for Lucas that evening with cake we'd brought from home. The kids played with their cousins, and everything felt normal, safe. We all slept well that first night. The only sounds were the usual forest noises, crickets, the occasional owl, and distant rustling of small animals. Nothing out of the ordinary. On Sunday morning, May 26th, we woke up early. The kids were full of energy, and after breakfast, we spent the morning doing typical camping stuff, exploring the immediate area around our campsite, teaching the kids how to identify different trees, and letting them collect pine cones. Around 2 in the afternoon, Miguel suggested we try one of the hiking trails. There's a nice one that starts just behind the restrooms, his brother told us. It's not too difficult, and the views are supposed to be great. We decided to check it out. Miguel, me, Sophia, and Lucas headed over, leaving our dogs at camp with Miguel's brother. In hindsight, I wish we'd brought them with us. Maybe they would have sensed something. The trail started off easy enough, a dirt path winding through tall ponderosa pines. The air smelled fresh, like pine needles and earth. Sophia had found a stick she was using as a hiking pole, tapping it against tree trunks as we walked. We'd gone maybe a block's distance up the trail when we spotted some wild raspberry bushes. Miguel pointed them out to the kids, explaining they weren't ripe yet. We stood there for a minute or two, just taking in the scenery. That's when it happened. Sophia tapped her stick against a tree trunk, and seconds later we heard it. The unmistakable sound of a large tree falling somewhere up ahead on the trail. It wasn't close enough to be dangerous, but the cracking and thudding sound echoed through the forest. The kids jumped, startled. "What was that?" Lucas asked, his voice suddenly small. "Just a tree falling," Miguel answered, though I could tell by his expression that he was unsettled too. "Happens all the time in forests. Dead trees eventually come down." We stood there for a moment, debating whether to continue. The trail ahead seemed to get darker, with denser tree coverage blocking the afternoon sun. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. "It's getting late anyway." It wasn't really, but something didn't feel right. Miguel nodded, and we turned around. That's when things started to get weird. I'm not sure why, but I found myself trailing behind as we headed back down the trail. The kids were up front with Miguel, maybe 20 feet ahead of me. I kept stopping to look at plants or adjust my shoe. Normal things, but each time I paused, I heard it. The sound of pine cones hitting the ground right behind me. Not falling naturally from trees, but as if someone was dropping them deliberately. The first time I turned around quickly, expecting to see another hiker. There was no one there, just the empty trail stretching back into the forest. I hurried to catch up with my family, telling myself it was nothing. But it happened again. And again. Each time I fell slightly behind, something would make a noise directly behind me. Pine cones hitting the dirt, twigs snapping. And each time I turned around, I saw nothing. By the time we reached the campground, I was genuinely spooked, but I didn't want to scare the kids. I told Miguel about it quietly while the children were playing later, but he just shrugged it off. "Probably just squirrels or birds in the trees," he said, "or maybe the wind knocking things loose." There hadn't been any wind, but I didn't argue. The rest of the evening passed normally. We had dinner, roasted marshmallows, and the kids played card games with their cousins until it got dark. Around 10, we all turned in for the night. I don't know exactly what time it was when Miguel got up, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. He whispered that he needed some air and unzipped the tent, sitting at the opening with his flashlight for a few minutes. When he came back in, Sophia suddenly sat up. "Someone's outside," she said, her voice crystal clear in the darkness. "It's just Dad," I told her, but she shook her head. "No, after Dad came back in. Someone walked right up to where he was sitting." Miguel flashed his light toward the tent opening, but there was nothing there. He assured Sophia she was dreaming and told her to go back to sleep. But I had seen it too, a shadow moving quickly to the same spot where Miguel had been sitting moments before. It looked like a person moving at a brisk pace, but something about the movement wasn't quite right. "I heard footsteps," Sophia insisted, "like someone walking in socks, really soft." Eventually she fell back asleep, as did Miguel. Lucas had slept through the whole thing, but I lay awake, listening. The night was strangely silent. No crickets, no owls, no rustling, just complete stillness. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I remember is jerking awake to a sound that made my skin crawl. Chewing. Loud, exaggerated chewing noises right outside our tent, near where my head was. open-mouth eating sounds that were almost animalistic but somehow deliberate. Whatever was making the noise sounded tall, taller than a person should be. It seemed to be standing directly above where I was lying. The bizarre feeding continued for about 15 minutes until something interrupted it. A distant sound from down the campground road, maybe a car door or someone at another campsite. The creature paused, and for a moment I thought it had left. But then it resumed, even louder than before. I lay perfectly still, afraid to wake Miguel or the kids, afraid to move at all. That's when I noticed the smell, a musky, earthy odor that wasn't quite like any animal I've encountered. It was strong and distinct, seeping through the mesh window of our tent. I inched closer to that window, desperate for fresh air despite my fear. Peering out, I could only see darkness, but I felt it. Whatever was behind our tent was standing tall, and I became increasingly convinced it wasn't an ordinary animal. Not a bear, not a coyote, not anything I could identify. After what felt like an eternity but was probably closer to 30 minutes, there was another sound from elsewhere in the campground. The chewing stopped abruptly. This time, whatever had been there vanished without making a sound. No retreating footsteps, no rustling vegetation. It was just gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I checked behind our tent, half expecting to find garbage strewn about or signs of an animal. There was nothing. Not a footprint, not a disturbed patch of ground. Nothing. We packed up early that day and headed home, cutting our trip short. I made up an excuse about not feeling well, but the truth was I couldn't bear another night there. It wasn't until weeks later that I started researching, trying to make sense of what happened. What I found shocked me to my core. Mount Graham has a history of Bigfoot sightings. Multiple accounts describe similar experiences: the sound of falling trees as a warning, the mimicking behavior, the distinctive smell, the abnormal height, the complete silence of the forest when it's present. I don't know what was outside our tent that night. I don't know what followed me on that trail. But I know it wasn't human, and it wasn't a normal forest animal either. To this day, when I hear chewing sounds, my blood runs cold. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can smell that musky odor again, even in our suburban home miles from any forest. We haven't been camping since. Miguel says it's silly that I'm letting my imagination run wild. Maybe he's right, but Sophia refuses to talk about it now, changing the subject whenever that trip comes up. And sometimes I catch her staring out into our backyard at night, as if she's watching for something. I still don't have answers. All I know is that something was watching us on Mount Graham that weekend. Something was following us. And whatever it was interested enough in us to come right up to our tent in the middle of the night. I can't prove what happened. I have no evidence, no photos, nothing but my experience and the lingering fear that sometimes, when we think we're alone in the wilderness, we're anything but. Story 7. I've never written about this before. For decades I kept it to myself, only telling close family and a few trusted friends. But after all these years, I think I'm ready to share what happened to me at Hidden Lake back in '59. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe I'm not alone. My husband Robert and I loved camping. We'd been doing it since we got married in '55, and Labor Day weekend was our tradition. That year, we decided to try somewhere new. Hidden Lake near Enderby, British Columbia. It was more remote than our usual spots, but the photos we'd seen were gorgeous, and Robert had heard the fishing was excellent. We arrived on Thursday before Labor Day weekend, wanting to get a few extra days in before the holiday crowds showed up. The drive was longer than expected, almost 2 hours on dirt roads after leaving the main highway. By the time we reached the lake, it was already mid-afternoon. I remember feeling instantly uneasy when we arrived. The lake was beautiful, crystal clear water surrounded by dense pine forest that climbed up the surrounding mountains. But something felt wrong. Robert didn't notice anything. He was too excited about setting up our new tent and trying out his fishing gear. We found a nice spot about 30 yards from the shoreline, partially hidden by trees, but with a clear path to the water. There wasn't another soul around, which initially seemed perfect. We set up camp, and Robert immediately headed to the water with his fishing rod while I organized our supplies. That first night was peaceful enough, though I woke several times thinking I heard something moving in the underbrush around our tent. Robert slept soundly beside me, and I convinced myself it was just forest animals. The next few days passed without incident. We hiked, fished, swam in the lake, and enjoyed the isolation. By Sunday, our fourth day there, I had almost forgotten my initial unease. We hadn't seen another person since arriving, which made sense given how difficult the lake was to access. That night, Robert seemed distracted during dinner. When I asked what was wrong, he just shrugged and said he felt a bit off. Probably just tired from all the hiking, he said, but I could tell something was bothering him. He went to bed early, and I stayed up a bit longer watching the campfire die down. Monday morning, Labor Day. I woke at dawn. Robert was still asleep, snoring softly. I decided to get up and organize our breakfast supplies before he woke. It was chilly that morning. My breath fogged in front of me as I pulled on my boots and sweater. I stepped outside the tent and immediately felt it. That sensation you get when someone's eyes are on you. It wasn't just a feeling, it was overwhelming, like a physical pressure against my skin. The hair on my arms stood up despite my heavy sweater. At first, I tried to ignore it. I busied myself gathering our cooking supplies from where we'd stored them in a waterproof bag hanging from a tree branch. But the feeling only intensified. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore and looked up toward a small knoll about 50 meters from our campsite. That's when I saw it. Partially hidden behind some low pine branches stood what I can only describe as a figure. Not quite a man, though it stood upright on two legs. It was tall, well over 6 feet, maybe closer to 7, and powerfully built across the shoulders and chest. But what made my blood run cold wasn't its size, it was its appearance. The creature was covered in thick, rust-colored hair, like old dried blood, that seemed to lighten around its chest area to more of a reddish brown. Its head was slouched forward, not quite between its shoulders, but not held upright either, like it was watching me from under a heavy brow. The face is what still haunts my nightmares. Parts of it were hairless, pink skin showing through like a severe burn victim. Where a nose should have been, there was just a flaccid area with 2 dark holes. Its mouth wasn't really a mouth at all, just an opening, almost like a wound in the lower part of its face. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They were dark and deeply set, but unmistakably intelligent. It wasn't watching me with the curiosity of a wild animal. It was studying me, analyzing me. I could feel its attention like a physical touch. I froze completely. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear, despite the hair. It wasn't a man, despite standing upright. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the cooking pot I was holding. The clatter seemed deafening in the morning silence. The creature didn't react to the noise. It just kept watching me with that unsettling, calculating gaze. Then, very slowly, it shifted its weight. I thought it might be preparing to move toward me, and that broke my paralysis. I backed away, never taking my eyes off it, until I felt the tent behind me. Then I scrambled inside, zipping the entrance shut, as if a thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. Robert was just waking up. "What's wrong?" he asked, seeing my face. I must have looked terrified. I couldn't tell him. Not yet. I was afraid he'd think I was crazy, or worse, that he'd go out there to look for himself. "Nothing," I lied. "Just saw a big animal, probably a bear. Startled me." He nodded, accepting my explanation, and started getting dressed. "Better be careful today then. Keep the food secured." I nodded, but I knew what I'd seen wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright for that long. Bears don't have faces like that. Bears don't watch you with intelligent, calculating eyes. Throughout the morning, I kept glancing toward the knoll, but the creature was gone, or at least no longer visible. Robert went fishing again, and I stayed at the campsite, jumping at every sound from the forest. I kept thinking about those eyes, that not-quite face. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide something watching me. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. A deep, primal fear had settled into my bones, not just of the creature, but of the entire place. Something was wrong here. We needed to leave. When Robert returned with his catch, I finally broke down and told him everything. I expected disbelief, maybe even laughter, but his reaction surprised me. He set down his fishing gear and sat heavily on the log we used as a bench. "I had a dream last night," he said quietly. "I don't remember much of it, but I woke up thinking we should leave this place. Today. As soon as possible." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You believe me?" "I don't know what you saw," he admitted, "but I trust you, and I trust this feeling. We'll pack up first thing tomorrow morning." That night was the longest of my life. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the cracking of twigs, the occasional splash from the lake. I lay awake for hours, listening, waiting. Robert tried to reassure me, but I could tell he was uneasy too. At one point, well past midnight, I heard what sounded like heavy breathing just outside our tent. Not animal breathing. It was too rhythmic, too controlled. I clutched Robert's arm so tightly I left bruises, but I didn't dare make a sound. Eventually, whatever it was moved away. When dawn finally broke, we packed up faster than we ever had before. Neither of us spoke much. We just worked methodically, wanting nothing more than to get in our car and drive away from this place. We were almost finished loading the car when we heard it. The sound of heavy footsteps running through the forest on the other side of the small river that fed into the lake. Not the light footfalls of a deer or even the heavier steps of a bear. These were bipedal steps, spaced like a human's but much heavier, making the ground seem to vibrate slightly. Robert and I froze, staring at each other. The footsteps faded into the distance and Robert whispered, "Let's go. Now." We left behind a cooking pot and one of our folding chairs in our haste to get away. I didn't care. I just wanted distance between us and whatever lurked in those woods. As we drove away, I kept looking in the side mirror, half expecting to see that rust-colored figure emerge from the trees and watch us leave. It never did, at least not where I could see it. We never went back to Hidden Lake. We never went camping again, period. Robert suggested it once, the following summer, but the look on my face must have told him everything he needed to know. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what I saw that day. Maybe it was a man in some kind of suit. But who would be out there, miles from civilization, just to scare random campers? Maybe it was a bear with some kind of disease that caused hair loss, but that wouldn't explain the upright posture, the intelligent eyes, the almost human-like study of me. I've read about Sasquatch sightings over the years. Some descriptions sound similar to what I saw, but most talk about creatures with more ape-like features. What I saw wasn't ape-like. It was something else. Something that looked like it had once been human, but had become something else entirely. I'm 68 years old now. Robert passed away 3 years ago, taking with him the only other person who knew something was out there with us that weekend. I've never told this story publicly before, but I'm not getting any younger, and I want someone else to know. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling those eyes on me, watching, studying, waiting. And I wonder if it's still out there, in those woods by Hidden Lake, watching other campers who venture too far into its territory. I don't know what it was. I don't know if anyone will believe me. but I know what I saw, and 60 years later, I still can't explain it. Story 8. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my family. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to put this somewhere because it's been 26 years and I still think about it almost every week. This happened in April of 1997. I was working nights at the hospital in Medina, doing the 11 to 7 shift as a nurse's aide. I was 34 then, married with 2 kids, living in a rural part of Orleans County, New York. Nothing special about me or my life, just an ordinary healthcare worker trying to make ends meet. That morning was foggy, not pea soup thick, but enough that the sunrise was just a vague glow through the mist. I remember it was around 6:15 or so when I left work. I was tired as hell after a particularly rough shift with 3 fall risks and an agitated dementia patient who hadn't slept all night. My route home took me across some railroad tracks that cut through farmland. There's this one crossing near Culvert Road where the gates are manual, no lights or automatic arms. You have to stop, look both ways, then proceed. I'd crossed these tracks hundreds of times without a second thought. That morning, I pulled up to the crossing and stopped. Force of habit made me look both ways, even though there weren't any trains scheduled that early. I looked left, eastward first, nothing but tracks disappearing into the fog. Then I looked right. That's when I saw it. About 100 yards down the track to the west was something large and dark. My first thought was bear, which made no sense even as I thought it. We don't have bears in Orleans County, at least not that anyone had ever reported. Besides, this thing was standing upright. I remember squinting, thinking maybe it was a person in a dark coat, but it was too big, way too big, and completely covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. The thing had already crossed the tracks and was walking, yes, walking on 2 legs, toward a line of brush and scrubby trees that ran parallel to the railroad. I only saw it for maybe 5 or 6 seconds, but what struck me was how it moved. One arm was swinging naturally like a person walking. The movement was smooth, deliberate, not like someone in a costume stumbling around. I can't properly explain the fear that washed over me. It wasn't like being startled or spooked. It was primal. Something deep in my brain was screaming danger in a way I'd never experienced before or since. My hands went ice cold on the steering wheel, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. When it disappeared into the brush line, I stomped on the gas pedal so hard the tires spun on the gravel before catching. I don't even remember the drive home. I just remember flying into my driveway, rushing inside, locking the door behind me, and standing in my kitchen with my heart pounding in my ears. My husband Mark was at the table having coffee before heading to work. He took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him what I'd seen, and he gave me that look, you know, the one where someone's trying to decide if you're joking or losing your mind. "Sounds like you need some sleep," he said. "Probably just a guy in a hunting outfit or something. In April on railroad tracks?" He shrugged and went back to his newspaper. "Maybe a homeless person, or your eyes playing tricks after a night shift." I couldn't argue. What I'd seen made no sense, and I was exhausted. But I knew what I saw wasn't human. It was too big, too different. I tried to sleep but couldn't. I kept replaying those few seconds in my head. The size of it, I'd guess at least 7 feet tall. The way it moved, not lumbering or awkward but purposeful, and that hair covering its entire body. Around noon, while I was making a sandwich, I suddenly remembered something my son Tommy had told me about 10 years earlier. He was about 10 at the time, and one early morning he'd gotten up to go fishing at Wide Waters, a section of the old Erie Canal about 5 miles from where I'd had my sighting. He'd come home in a panic that morning, his fishing pole dragging behind his bike, saying he'd seen a Bigfoot. I hadn't believed him, of course. I'd assumed it was his imagination, or a way to get out of being in trouble for coming home early when he was supposed to be fishing. But now I wondered. I called Tommy that afternoon. He was 20 by then, working construction in Rochester. "Remember that time you said you saw something at Wide Waters?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You mean when I saw a Bigfoot and you and Dad told me I was making it up?" He sounded amused, but with an edge of old hurt. "What exactly did you see?" I asked. He went quiet for a moment. "Mom, I've told you this like 100 times. It was tall, covered in dark hair, walking on 2 legs. I was on my bike heading to my fishing spot, and it crossed the path about 50 feet ahead of me. I dropped my bike and ran all the way back to the road." "Why are you asking about this now?" he asked. So I told him. There was a long silence when I finished. "You believe me now, don't you?" he finally said. I did. The next few weeks, I avoided that railroad crossing. I took the long way around, adding 15 minutes to my commute. I also started paying attention to the woods near our house in a way I never had before. Our place wasn't exactly remote, but we had about 3 acres backing up to a stretch of woodland that eventually connected to farm fields, and if you went far enough, to the canal system. Those brush lines I mentioned, they're like highways connecting all the wooded patches throughout the county. A person or something else could travel for miles without ever being in the open for long. About a month after my sighting, I started hearing things at night. Not every night, but often enough to notice a pattern. Usually after 11 at night, sometimes as late as 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd hear vocalizations coming from the woods behind our house. I've lived in the country my whole life. I know what owls sound like, what foxes sound like when they scream, what coyotes sound like when they howl. These sounds weren't any of those. The best way I can describe them is like someone trying to imitate a wolf howl, but with a deeper chest voice. Sometimes there would be a series of whoops that would start low and rise in pitch. Other times it was like wood knocking against wood, but rhythmic, almost deliberate. Mark never heard them, or claimed he didn't. He's a heavy sleeper, and by then he'd written off my Bigfoot story as stress or an overactive imagination. But I heard them, and so did our dog, a lab mix named Buddy, who would stand at the back door growling whenever those sounds started up. One night in June of that same year, I was up late doing laundry when I heard something heavy moving around near our shed. It was around 1 in the morning, and Mark was asleep upstairs. Buddy started going crazy, barking and scratching at the back door. I shut off all the lights and looked out the kitchen window. The moon was bright enough that I could see the yard pretty clearly. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, something moved by the edge of the woods. It was just a shadow, really, darker than the surrounding darkness. But it was big, and it was moving. I couldn't make out details, but whatever it was seemed to be standing just inside the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the house. I stood frozen at that window for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then the shape moved back into the woods and disappeared. Buddy kept growling for another hour. The next morning I went out to check if there was any evidence of what I'd seen. The ground was still wet with dew, but near the edge of the woods I found an area where the grass was matted down, like something heavy had been standing there, and on a low-hanging branch caught on the bark was a tuft of dark hair. Not like deer hair or anything I recognized. It was coarse and long, maybe 3 or 4 inches in length. I took that hair and put it in a Ziploc bag. I still have it somewhere, though I've never shown it to anyone or had it analyzed. What would be the point? Who would I even take it to? Over the years, I've heard those sounds off and on, less frequently now, but still occasionally. I've never had another clear sighting like that April morning, though. Just glimpses of movement, shadows that seemed too large, too deliberate to be normal wildlife. I've read books about Bigfoot and similar creatures since then. I've even attended a couple of those conferences they hold, though I've never shared my story publicly. Most of the people there strike me as either true believers or thrill seekers. I'm neither. I'm just someone who saw something I can't explain. My son Tommy and I talk about our experiences sometimes. He's had a couple more possible sightings over the years, usually when hunting or fishing at dawn. Nothing as clear as his childhood encounter, but enough to keep him convinced. Mark still thinks it's nonsense, though he's kinder about it now. If believing in Bigfoot makes you happy, then believe in Bigfoot, he says. But it doesn't make me happy. If anything, it makes me uneasy. I still work in healthcare, though I switched to day shift years ago. I still drive those back roads through Orleans County. And yes, I still cross those railroad tracks sometimes, though I always look carefully down the tracks in both directions. I don't know what I saw that foggy April morning in 1997. I don't know what makes those sounds in the woods behind my house, but I know what I experienced was real. Whatever it was, it's out there, moving through those brush lines, connecting those patches of wilderness that most people just drive past without a second thought. Sometimes when I'm driving home late and past those dark stretches of woods, I can't help but wonder, is it watching me right now? And what would happen if my car broke down here, leaving me alone in the dark with whatever walks through these woods when no one is looking? Story 9. I've been sitting on this experience for a long time. 4 years, to be exact. I never told anyone outside my family because, well, who would believe me? But after stumbling across this community and reading similar accounts, I think I'm finally ready to share what happened that summer night when I was 12. My family has always been big on camping. Every summer since I can remember, my dad would take me, my 2 younger brothers, and usually my cousin Jake, up to this remote spot in the Cascade Mountains. It's not an official campground or anything, just this little clearing my dad discovered years ago when he was hiking. You have to drive about an hour down these unmarked Forest Service roads to get there. No bathrooms, no fire pits, nothing but wilderness. Dad always said that's what made it special. That particular trip started out normal enough. We arrived Friday afternoon, set up our tents, us kids in one, Dad in another, caught some fish in the nearby stream for dinner, and spent the evening around the campfire telling the same stupid jokes we always did. The spot had this big meadow about 200 yards behind our campsite, surrounded by really dense forest. Super beautiful during the day, but honestly kind of creepy at night. I remember having trouble falling asleep that night. Jake was snoring, and my brother Caleb kept kicking me in his sleep. I must have finally dozed off around midnight because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to this weird sound. It was knocking, like someone taking a baseball bat and hitting a tree. Loud, deliberate knocks that echoed through the forest. Thunk, thunk, thunk. I froze in my sleeping bag, listening. It sounded like it was coming from the edge of the meadow behind our tents. At first, I thought maybe it was a woodpecker, but it was the middle of the night, and the knocks were too spaced out, too deliberate. Thunk, thunk, thunk. 3 distinct knocks, then silence. I looked around our tent. Caleb, Tommy, and Jake were all still sound asleep. How could they sleep through this? My heart was racing. I'd been watching these wilderness shows with my dad, and I remembered an episode about Bigfoot researchers using wood knocks to communicate. They said Bigfoot used knocks to talk to each other in the forest. The knocking came again. This time it sounded different, like it was coming from the opposite side of the meadow. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Like something was answering the first set of knocks. I couldn't just lie there. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as possible, slipped on my shoes, and crawled out of the tent. The night air was cold against my skin. It was that deep, middle-of-the-night darkness where even the moon doesn't help much. I could barely make out my dad's tent about 15 feet away. I ran over and whispered frantically at the tent entrance, "Dad, Dad, wake up!" I heard him stirring inside. "Ethan, what's wrong?" His voice was groggy. "I think there's a Bigfoot out there," I whispered, feeling kind of stupid saying it out loud. "There's knocking sounds coming from the woods." I expected him to laugh or tell me to go back to sleep. Instead, he unzipped his tent and stuck his head out. "What kind of knocking?" Just then, it happened again. Thunk, thunk, thunk. From the far side of the meadow, Dad's eyes widened. He grabbed his flashlight and crawled out of the tent. "How long has this been going on?" he whispered. "I just woke up to it maybe 5 minutes ago," I said. We stood there in silence, waiting. Then from the opposite direction, closer to us, thunk, thunk, thunk. "It's like they're talking to each other," I whispered, my voice shaking a little. Dad nodded slowly. He wasn't dismissing this. He wasn't telling me it was just a woodpecker or a falling branch. The look on his face made my stomach tighten. He was taking this seriously. "I've heard about this," he said quietly. "Wood knocking. It's one of the behaviors researchers talk about." We listened for a few more minutes. The pattern continued, knocks from one side, then a response from the other, like a conversation was happening around us. Then Dad said something that nearly stopped my heart. "Let's answer them." "What?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Just follow me. Stay close." He reached back into his tent and pulled out a jacket, which he handed to me. "Put this on. It's cold." The jacket was way too big, but I didn't care. I slipped it on as Dad found a fallen branch about the size of a baseball bat. He handed me his flashlight and picked up the branch. "We're going to walk toward the meadow," he whispered. "Not too far, just to where we can see the open space. Then I'm going to knock and see what happens." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Part of me wanted to run back to the tent and hide in my sleeping bag. But another part, the part that always wanted to impress my dad, was excited. This was an adventure, something I'd remember forever. We walked slowly through the trees toward the meadow. The knocking had stopped, but the forest didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting, listening. We reached the edge of the trees where the meadow opened up before us, a dark expanse under the night sky. Dad took the branch and struck a nearby tree trunk. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound cut through the night air like a knife. We waited, barely breathing. 30 seconds passed. Nothing. Then, from far across the meadow, thunk, thunk, thunk. Dad looked at me, his eyes wide with excitement. "Did you hear that?" It responded. Then from much closer, maybe 100 yards to our right, thunk, thunk, thunk. "There's more than one," I whispered. Dad nodded. He seemed both thrilled and nervous. "Let's get the camera," he said. We hurried back to the campsite, where Dad grabbed his digital camera from his backpack. He quickly pulled on his boots and a sweatshirt. I was still wearing his jacket, which hung down past my knees. "Should we wake up the others?" I asked. Dad shook his head. "Your brothers would just make too much noise. And Jake, well, you know Jake would either be too scared or try to scare whatever's out there away." He was right. My cousin Jake was 14 and thought he was tough. He'd probably start yelling or throwing rocks. This time, Dad led us in the direction of the closest knocking sound. We moved away from the meadow and deeper into the woods. The forest was thick here, with tall pines and undergrowth that grabbed at our ankles. Dad kept the flashlight beam pointed at the ground just ahead of our feet, not wanting to shine it into the distance. The knocking had stopped, but the forest wasn't silent anymore. As we walked, I started hearing other sounds, branches snapping in the distance, the rustle of movement through the underbrush. With each step we took, these sounds seemed to get closer. We paused near a massive old pine tree. Dad turned off the flashlight. "Listen," he whispered. In the darkness, I could hear it clearly now. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps that actually made the ground vibrate slightly beneath my feet. They were slow, deliberate steps with long pauses between them. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. These weren't deer. Deer move quickly with light steps. These were too heavy, too measured, and they weren't from a person either. The cadence was all wrong. The steps were too far apart, like whatever was making them had a stride twice as long as a man's. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What is that?" He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently. "I don't know for sure. he said softly. "But I think we're hearing what most people spend their whole lives hoping to find." We stood, frozen in that spot, not out of fear exactly, but something more like awe. The footsteps continued, circling around us at a distance of maybe 50 yards, never coming closer, never moving away, just circling. I remember thinking how strange it was that I wasn't more scared. I was nervous, sure, but there was something almost respectful about the way these things were moving. They knew we were there. They could have charged us or run away, but instead they were just observing, communicating, maybe even trying to figure us out the same way we were trying to figure them out. Dad raised the camera, but in the pitch darkness, I knew it wouldn't capture anything. Still, he snapped a few photos, the flash briefly illuminating the trees around us but showing nothing beyond. The footsteps stopped. For several minutes we heard nothing. Then, from about 30 yards to our left, thunk, thunk, thunk. Dad raised his branch and answered, thunk, thunk, thunk. The response was immediate and from much closer than before. Thunk, thunk, thunk. "It's coming closer," I whispered. Dad nodded. "I think it's curious about us." That's when we heard a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. From somewhere in the darkness ahead of us came a low, rumbling growl that turned into something like a moan. It wasn't aggressive, it was almost like a question. The sound was so deep, I could feel it in my chest, like when you stand too close to a big speaker at a concert. Dad's hand tightened on my shoulder. I could feel him trembling slightly. The moaning sound came again, followed by heavy breathing. Whatever was making that sound was massive. You could hear the depth and power in its lungs. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The breathing continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, as if the creature was moving back and forth, trying to catch our scent. Then Dad whispered, "I think we should head back now," slowly. We began to back away, step by uncareful step. The breathing followed us, always keeping the same distance, not threatening, just present. As we neared the campsite, the sounds faded. By the time we reached the tents, the forest had fallen silent again. My brothers and cousin were still asleep, completely unaware of what had just happened. Dad and I sat outside his tent for a while, not talking much, just processing what we'd experienced. "What do you think it was?" I finally asked. Dad was quiet for a long time before answering. "I don't know for sure, but whatever it was intelligent. Those knocks weren't random. That was communication." "Bigfoot?" I whispered the word like it might summon them back. Dad shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe something science hasn't properly documented yet. Either way, I think we were just part of a conversation that's been going on in these woods for thousands of years." We eventually went back to our tents, though I don't think either of us slept much. In the morning, Dad and I went back to where we'd been standing in the woods. The ground was too hard and leaf-covered to show footprints, but we found broken branches high up, way higher than a person could reach, and some hair caught on tree bark that didn't match any animal we knew. Dad took the hair samples home, but never sent them anywhere for testing. He said some experiences were meant to stay between those who were there. The photos from the camera showed nothing but trees and darkness. I'm 16 now, and we still camp in that same spot every summer. We've never heard the knocking again, though sometimes when I'm alone at the edge of the meadow, I feel like something's watching me from the trees. Not in a threatening way, more like checking in on an old friend. I don't know what we encountered that night. I just know that the woods feel different to me now, like they're full of secrets that most people walk right past without ever noticing. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough and patient enough, the forest might just decide to share one of those secrets with you. Story 10. I still get goosebumps talking about this. It happened last Thursday when I was driving with my best friend Jake to the regional debate tournament at Del Norte High. We were running late because Jake forgot his notes at home and we had to double back. By the time we hit the road again, we were cutting it close. I decided to take Old Mill Road. It's this narrow back route that cuts through the redwoods outside Crescent City. Most people stick to the highway, but I've been taking this shortcut since I got my license 2 years ago. It shaves about 15 minutes off the drive, and we needed every minute we could get. It was around 6:30 in the evening, already getting dark this time of year. My old Honda Civic doesn't have the best headlights, but they were enough to see the road ahead. Jake was shuffling through his notes, mumbling his opening arguments under his breath. I remember being annoyed because he kept fidgeting with the heater vent. The road follows Harmon Creek for a few miles, and it gets really tight in some sections, barely enough room for 2 cars to pass each other. There's this one stretch where the trees hang so low they form this tunnel, and the creek bends right alongside the road with just a small ditch and some rocks separating you from the water. We were about halfway through the drive when we hit that narrow section. I slowed down a bit, maybe to 40 miles per hour, because there are sometimes deer in this area. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought someone had dumped a pile of trash or maybe a rolled-up carpet in the middle of the road. But as we got closer, maybe 50 feet away, I realized it was moving. It was crouching, hunched down right in the center of my lane. "What the hell is that?" I remember saying. Jake looked up from his notes. "Slow down," he shouted, but I was already hitting the brakes. The thing was big, way bigger than a dog or even a bear cub. It was covered in this thick, dark fur, almost black, but with these weird brownish patches. The fur looked matted and long, especially around what I guess was its shoulders. I couldn't see a face because it was facing away from us, but its back was massive, hunched and muscular. Here's the thing that still freaks me out. It wasn't startled by our headlights or the sound of the car. It just stayed there, perfectly still, like it was waiting for something, or waiting for us. I couldn't swerve left because of the creek, and there was a steep embankment on the right. I had no choice but to slow down and try to stop before hitting it. We were maybe 10 feet away when it moved. God, the way it moved. I've never seen anything move that fast. It didn't run away like a normal animal. It was like it rolled or twisted sideways, but so quickly it was almost a blur. 1 second it was there, and the next it was just gone. I didn't even see which direction it went. I slammed on the brakes anyway, and we skidded a bit on the damp pavement. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I checked my rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. No eyes reflecting in the darkness, no movement in the brush. Nothing. "Did you see that?" Jake's voice was weird, higher pitched than normal. I nodded but couldn't speak. My mouth had gone completely dry. We sat there for maybe 30 seconds, both of us scanning the trees and the road behind us. "What was it?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I managed to say. "A bear, maybe." But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. And it wasn't shaped right. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the back legs too long. I slowly took my foot off the brake and started driving again. My hands were still shaking, and I had to focus hard on the road. Neither of us said anything for the next few minutes. The only sound was the tires on the pavement and the creek running alongside us. When we finally reached the end of Old Mill Road, where it connects to the highway, Jake broke the silence. "That wasn't normal, Mel." "I know. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or anything I've ever seen before." "I know," I repeated. "It was like a giant monkey or something, but we don't have monkeys here." I remember feeling cold all over despite the heater blasting. It was too big for a monkey, way too big. "Did you see how fast it moved?" Jake turned to look back, even though we were miles away now. It was like it disappeared. We tried to rationalize it as we drove the rest of the way to the school. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank. Maybe the shadows in our headlights created an optical illusion. But deep down, we both knew better. We made it to the debate tournament with just minutes to spare. Somehow we went through the motions, checked in, separated to our assigned rooms, did our debates. I don't remember a single argument I made. My mind kept replaying those few seconds on the road. During the break between rounds, Jake and I found each other by the water fountain. "We should report it," he said in a low voice. "Report what?" "That we saw a giant hairy thing that moved impossibly fast. Who would we even tell?" "I don't know. The rangers, maybe? What if it attacks someone?" I hadn't considered that. "Do you think it's dangerous?" Jake looked at me like I was crazy. "Did you see the size of it? Those shoulders? It could tear a person apart." After the tournament, we lost, unsurprisingly. Neither of us could focus. We drove back the long way, taking the highway despite it adding 20 minutes to the trip. No way were we going back down Old Mill Road in the dark. When I dropped Jake off at his house, he paused before getting out of the car. "Let's look it up online, see if anyone else has reported anything like this around here." I spent hours that night searching online. Unexplained creatures, Northern California. Hairy animal, Crescent City. Fast-moving beast, Del Norte County. I found some old Bigfoot reports, but none of them matched what we saw. Bigfoot supposedly walks upright, and this thing was definitely on all fours, at least when we spotted it. The closest thing I found was an article about baboon sightings in Texas, of all places, escaped exotic pets that had supposedly established a small population. But this wasn't a baboon. It was too big, too bulky. And baboons don't live in the cold, damp forests of Northern California. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hulking shape in the middle of the road. I kept thinking about how it didn't run from the car like a normal animal would. It waited until the last second, like it was testing us, or playing with us. The next morning, I texted Jake, "Should we drive out there in daylight, look for tracks or something?" His response came quickly, "No way. Bad idea." I was relieved. Part of me wanted answers, but a bigger part was terrified of finding them. At school on Friday, we tried to tell our friend Amber about it. She laughed and asked if we'd been smoking something before the debate. I don't blame her. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. That weekend, I drove to the library and looked through local history books and newspaper archives. I found some old articles about strange sightings in the forests around Crescent City, dating back to the 1970s. But they were vague, mostly attributed to Bigfoot enthusiasts or dismissed as hoaxes. One article from 1986 caught my attention, though. A logger claimed to have seen a dark, fast-moving creature that moved like nothing natural near Harmon Creek. The article was small, buried on page 12, with a dismissive tone suggesting the logger had been drinking. It's been 5 days now, and I still jump at shadows when I'm driving at night. I haven't taken Old Mill Road since it happened, even in daylight. Jake and I have talked about it every day, comparing details, making sure we're remembering the same thing. The weird thing is, the more I think about it, the more I remember. Details that didn't register in the moment keep surfacing, like how there was no steam from its breath, even though it was cold enough to see ours in the car, or how the fur seemed to absorb the light from our headlights rather than reflect it, and something about its posture, like it was too dense, too solid to be a flesh and blood animal. Yesterday, Jake suggested we drive out there with his dad's hunting camera to set it up near that spot. I shut that down immediately. Whatever that thing was, I don't want to see it again, and I definitely don't want to be out on that road looking for it. I keep trying to convince myself it was just some animal I couldn't identify in the bad light, but then I remember how it moved, that impossible fluid motion that defied physics. No living creature moves like that, at least no creature I know of. I haven't told my parents. What would I even say? Hey, I think I almost hit some unknown species on Old Mill Road. They'd either think I was making it up, or they'd freak out and forbid me from driving that road again, which honestly, I'm already doing on my own. The worst part is the feeling that stayed with me since that night, this creeping sensation that we weren't supposed to see it, that we glimpsed something that exists alongside our world but separate from it, something that normally stays hidden. And now I can't shake the feeling that it knows we saw it, that somehow, by witnessing it, we've opened a door that can't be closed. I keep checking my rear-view mirror when I drive now, even on main roads in broad daylight. I've started taking different routes to school, even though they're longer. Jake says he's been having nightmares about it. I don't know what we saw on that road. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or something else. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't normal. The way it moved, the way it vanished. It was like it slipped sideways out of reality. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, crouching in the middle of some lonely road, waiting for headlights to approach. And I wonder what happens to the drivers who can't stop in time. Story 11. I still can't believe what happened that night back in the fall of '97. It's been over 25 years, and I've never really told this story to anyone outside my immediate circle because, well, who the hell would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest. I was 23 at the time, living in Beechwood, Michigan, about as rural as you can get. Just woods, farms, and small houses scattered throughout. I had this buddy, Mark, who I'd known since high school. His girlfriend, Sarah, had called me around 8 in the evening, completely freaking out. Her dog was having some kind of seizure, and Mark was out of town visiting his parents. I didn't think twice about it. I hopped in my S10 Blazer and drove the 15 minutes to her place. When I got there, her German Shepherd was fine. Apparently the seizure had stopped, but Sarah was still shaken up. I spent about an hour there calming her down, making sure the dog was okay. It was actually kind of awkward because I didn't know Sarah that well, but she was grateful for the company. By the time I left, it was getting late, maybe around 10 or so. The smart thing would have been to take the main road back home, but for some stupid reason, I decided to cut through the back roads. I thought it would be quicker, and honestly, I'd driven those roads a million times. Hughes Lake Road to Deckerville. Simple. It was pitch black out there. No streetlights, no houses for stretches at a time. Just my headlights cutting through the darkness. Trees on either side of the narrow road. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station, and I was just thinking about what I needed to do the next day at work. I made the turn onto Deckerville Road when something caught my attention. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 40 or 50 feet ahead, something massive moved across the road. I immediately slowed down, not sure what I was seeing. My headlights caught it in the beam, and I felt this, I don't know how to describe it, this cold rush of fear wash over me. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't normal. It was huge. I mean huge. Easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with dark brown fur or hair covering its body. It moved on 2 legs, but not like a human. There was something off about the way it walked, like it had joints in places we don't. The really freaky part was how it reacted to my headlights. It stopped dead in its tracks and turned toward my truck. I swear to God, it seemed confused, like it was trying to figure out which way I was coming from. It stood there for maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like forever. I can still see its silhouette against the darkness. Then, in just a few strides, this thing covered ground like you wouldn't believe. It disappeared into the woods on the right side of the road. It didn't run like a person or an animal. It was too fluid, too fast. I sat there in my Blazer, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't move. I literally couldn't process what I'd just seen. Then I remembered I wasn't alone. My buddy Mark was in the passenger seat. He'd decided to come with me to Sarah's place and was now sitting there completely silent. I glanced over at him, and his face was drained of all color. Did you see that?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the spot. where the thing had vanished. "What the fuck was that?" he whispered. I didn't answer because I had no idea. My mind was racing through possibilities. A bear standing on its hind legs. No way. Bears drop to all fours when they run, and this thing stayed upright. A moose. Too tall, wrong shape. Some guy in a costume. Who the hell would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that? I don't know what came over me, but I suddenly felt this overwhelming need to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. I put the truck in reverse and started backing up toward where the creature had crossed. "What are you doing?" Mark hissed, grabbing my arm. "Are you insane? Let's get the hell out of here." "I just want to see if there are any tracks," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "It might have been a deer or something." "That was not a deer, Jason," Mark said, his voice cracking. "You know it wasn't." I ignored him and kept backing up until we reached the spot. I stopped the truck, leaving the headlights on and the engine running. Part of me was terrified that the thing was still nearby, watching us from the darkness of the trees. "Stay in the truck," I told Mark as I reached for the door handle. "Are you fucking kidding me? Don't go out there." But I was already opening the door. The cold air hit me like a slap. It was freezing that night, maybe in the high 20s. The ground was hard, almost frozen. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the glove compartment and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel at the edge of the road. I shined the light on the asphalt, then over to the shoulder and into the tree line. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything had passed through there at all. Not even tire tracks from my own vehicle showed on the frozen ground. It was like the thing had never existed. I walked a few feet into the woods, sweeping my flashlight back and forth. The trees stood silent, their bare branches reaching up like skeletal fingers against the night sky. I could hear Mark calling me from the truck, his voice tight with fear. "Jason, get back here now!" I took one last look around, then hurried back to the Blazer, locking the door as soon as I got in. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. "Nothing," I said, my breath fogging in the cold cab. "No tracks, nothing." Mark was silent for a moment, then said, "We need to go. Right now." I put the truck in drive and pressed the gas harder than I needed to. The tires spun a bit before catching, and we shot forward down Deckerville Road. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "I've seen it before," he said quietly. I nearly drove off the road. "What? When?" He took a deep breath. "Last year, on my parents' property. I was out checking the back fence line. You know where the woods get thick? It was just before sunset. I thought it was a guy at first, some hunter who'd wandered onto our land. I saw what looked like a man in a fur coat leaning against a tree about 100 yards away. My stomach dropped as he continued. I yelled out, asking who was there. The thing turned around, and I knew immediately it wasn't human. It moved too weirdly, and it was massive. I had my hunting rifle with me, but I was so scared I dropped it. The thing just took off into the woods. I ran all the way back to the house and never told anyone. I thought I was losing my mind. "Did you ever go back for your rifle?" I asked. Mark shook his head. "Not alone. I made my dad go with me the next day. Told him I tripped and dropped it. I haven't been out to that part of the property by myself since." We drove the rest of the way in silence. When I dropped Mark off at his place, he looked at me and said, "We don't talk about this, okay? People will think we're crazy." I nodded, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the image of that thing in my head, its size, the way it moved, how it seemed to be assessing us. It was intelligent, I was sure of it. And that terrified me more than anything. The next day, I went to the library and started researching. I looked up local wildlife, thinking maybe there was some rational explanation I was missing. Bears, moose, elk, nothing matched what we'd seen. Then I started looking into local legends, folklore about creatures in the woods. I found some old newspaper clippings about strange sightings dating back to the 70s. hunters claiming to have seen wildmen in the forests around Beechwood. One account from 1982 described a large, hair-covered creature crossing M25 near Port Sanilac, less than 30 miles from where we had our encounter. The witness, a truck driver, described it almost exactly as what Mark and I had seen. I became obsessed. I started driving out to Deckerville Road in the daytime, searching the woods for any sign of the creature. I never found anything concrete, just occasionally some broken branches too high up for a normal animal to reach, and once what looked like a large footprint in some soft mud near a creek bed. But it had rained recently, and the print was too distorted to be conclusive. I tried to talk to Mark about it again, but he shut me down. He didn't want to remember that night. Can't say I blame him. About a month after our encounter, I was at the local diner when I overheard a couple of hunters talking. One of them mentioned how his hunting dogs had refused to go into a certain section of the woods north of Deckerville Road. Said they'd just sit down and howl, wouldn't move for anything. The other hunter nodded knowingly and said his cousin had found a deer carcass in that same area, completely torn apart in a way that didn't match any predator he'd ever seen. I wanted to join their conversation, to tell them what I'd seen, but I knew how it would sound. In a small town like Beechwood, you don't want to be known as the guy who claims to have seen monsters in the woods. So I kept it to myself, for years. Every now and then, I'd hear stories. Someone's livestock acting strange, unusual noises in the woods at night, a hiker going missing for days, only to turn up miles from where they should have been, with no memory of what happened. Small things that most people would dismiss, but that made perfect sense to me. I moved away from Beechwood in 2001, but I still think about that night. Sometimes I convince myself it was just a bear, or that Mark and I somehow shared some bizarre hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw. Whatever that thing was on Deckerville Road, it wasn't something that should exist in our world. It moved with purpose, with intelligence. And sometimes, especially on dark nights when I'm alone, I can't shake the feeling that it knew exactly what it was doing when it crossed in front of my truck. Like it wanted to be seen, like it was sending a message. This is my territory. You're just passing through. I've never gone back to those woods, never will. Some things are better left alone, undisturbed in the darkness where they belong. But I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. And I pray that no one else has to experience what I did that night on Deckerville Road. Story 12. I've never told this story outside my immediate family, but it's been over 35 years now, and I still can't make sense of what happened that day. I guess writing it down might help me process it, even after all this time. It was early October 1986. I was 17, on my annual hunting trip with my dad and Uncle Mike in the mountains near Vasquez Creek, Colorado. We'd been doing these trips since I was 13, but this one was special because I'd finally convinced Dad to let me carry my own rifle instead of just tagging along. We'd arrived at the cabin the night before, and I remember waking up to Dad shaking my shoulder around 4:30 in the morning. "Rise and shine, Tommy," he whispered. "Fresh powder out there, perfect tracking conditions." It had snowed about 6 inches overnight, that perfect light powder that makes everything quiet. The kind where you can hear a pine needle drop from 50 feet away. We had a quick breakfast, instant coffee and oatmeal, and headed out just as the sky was starting to lighten up. The cold hit me like a slap when we stepped outside. Must have been around 15 degrees, and my breath hung in the air like little clouds. We trudged through the snow in silence, following a route Dad had mapped out the previous evening. Uncle Mike was behind me, occasionally mumbling about the cold. He wasn't really the outdoorsy type like Dad, but he came along every year anyway. Looking back, I think he just wanted to spend time with his brother. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we crested this ridge. The sun was just coming up over the mountains, turning the snow this pinkish gold color. Beautiful, in that way that makes you feel small and insignificant. Dad stopped suddenly and held up his hand, the signal for us to freeze. At first I didn't see what had caught his attention. Then I noticed it, these tracks in the otherwise pristine snow, about 200 yards ahead of us. They came out from this dense stand of pines, descended the ridge through an open area, then curved around in this weird pattern before heading back into the trees. From our vantage point, it looked almost like an omega symbol, this perfect arc across the mountainside. What kind of idiot would be walking around in this cold making circles? I asked, not really expecting an answer. It seemed so pointless, especially in weather like that. Dad didn't respond. He was squinting at the tracks, his expression unreadable. Uncle Mike had already unslung his pack and was digging for his binoculars, expensive ones he'd bought specifically for this trip. Probably just some lost hiker, Dad finally said, but he didn't sound convinced. There was something about his tone that made me uneasy. Dad was a former forest ranger. He knew these mountains better than anyone. If something puzzled him, it was worth being concerned about. Uncle Mike had his binoculars out now and was scanning the area where the tracks disappeared back into the trees. His hands were steady, methodically sweeping the tree line. I remember thinking he looked unusually focused. Uncle Mike was typically the joker of the family, always cracking wise and rarely taking anything seriously. After maybe 2 or 3 minutes of silent observation, something changed. Uncle Mike's whole body went rigid. He was still holding the binoculars to his eyes, but now he was completely motionless, like he'd seen a ghost. The only movement was his knuckles turning white as he gripped the binoculars tighter. "Uncle Mike," I called out. No response. "Hey, what do you see?" Nothing. He just kept staring through those binoculars, frozen in place. Dad had noticed too and was looking at his brother with growing concern. "Mike," Dad said sharply, "what is it?" Uncle Mike finally lowered the binoculars after what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. His face was drained of all color and his hands were visibly shaking now. I'd never seen him like that before. Uncle Mike was a Vietnam vet who'd seen combat. Not much rattled him. "What did you see?" I asked again. He shook his head slightly, avoiding eye contact with both of us. "You'll just make fun of me," he muttered. Dad stepped closer to him. "Mike, seriously, what was it?" Uncle Mike swallowed hard. I could see a film of sweat on his forehead despite the cold. "I think," he started, then stopped himself. He took a deep breath. "I think I just saw a Bigfoot." I almost laughed, but something in his expression stopped me. Uncle Mike wasn't joking. Whatever he'd seen had genuinely terrified him. "Where?" Dad asked, his voice low and serious. He wasn't dismissing it outright, which surprised me. Uncle Mike gestured vaguely toward where the tracks re-entered the forest. Just inside the tree line, it was watching us. What did it look like? I couldn't help asking. Uncle Mike shook his head again. "I don't want to talk about it." He was already repacking his binoculars with shaking hands. "We need to go. Now." The mood had shifted completely. The excited anticipation of the hunt was gone, replaced by this heavy tension that made it hard to breathe. Dad looked torn, like part of him wanted to investigate further, but one look at his brother's face seemed to make the decision for him. "All right," Dad said quietly. "We'll head back down and try the eastern ridge instead." We turned around and started back the way we came. No one spoke for at least 15 minutes. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from those trees. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt menacing, like it was hiding something that didn't want to be found. Finally, when we were well away from the ridge, I worked up the courage to press Uncle Mike again. "Was it really a Bigfoot? What exactly did you see?" He stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression was deadly serious. "Tommy, I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I've seen things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life. But I have never, ever been as scared as I was looking at that thing. But what did it look like? I persisted. Uncle Mike looked at me for a long moment, then glanced at Dad. It was standing just inside the tree line, partially hidden behind a pine. Tall, way taller than a man. Dark, matted fur, but it was the eyes. He trailed off, swallowing hard. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there. It was watching us, studying us, like it was deciding something. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. And those tracks, Uncle Mike continued, almost whispering now. That wasn't someone wandering around. That was a pattern. It was deliberate. What do you mean? Dad asked. I mean, it knew we were coming. It made those tracks on purpose. Dad frowned. That doesn't make any sense, Mike. None of this makes any sense, Uncle Mike snapped. But I know what I saw. We continued walking in silence after that. Eventually we made our way to the eastern ridge as Dad had suggested, but the enthusiasm was gone. We went through the motions of hunting, but our hearts weren't in it. Every snapping twig made us freeze. Every shadow in the trees seemed to hide something watching us. We didn't get anything that day. Around noon, Dad suggested we head back to the cabin early. No one objected. That night at the cabin, Uncle Mike drank more than usual. He sat by the fire with a bottle of whiskey, barely speaking. Once, I caught him staring out the window into the darkness, his hand absently touching the binoculars case, like he was making sure it was still there. The next morning, Dad announced we were packing up and heading home, cutting our trip short by 2 days. Uncle Mike looked relieved. I was disappointed, but didn't argue. The atmosphere was too strange, too tense. As we were loading up the truck, I noticed Uncle Mike scanning the tree line one last time, his jaw tight. Do you think it followed us? I asked quietly. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, I don't know, Tommy, but I'll tell you this, I'm never coming back to these mountains again. And he never did. Every year after that, when Dad suggested the annual hunting trip, Uncle Mike always had an excuse. Too busy at work, bad timing, back problems. Dad and I never saw anything unusual on our subsequent trips, though we never returned to that specific area again. We never found tracks like those again either. But sometimes, when we were sitting around the campfire at night, I'd catch Dad staring into the darkness beyond our circle of light, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. Uncle Mike passed away 3 years ago, heart attack in his sleep. At his funeral, Dad and I finally talked about that day. Do you think he really saw something? I asked. Dad was quiet for a long time. Your uncle wasn't a man who scared easily, he finally said. And he wasn't a liar. Whatever he saw that day through those binoculars, it was real to him. Do you believe in Bigfoot? I pressed. Dad gave me a small, sad smile. I believe there are things in this world we don't understand, Tommy. Things that don't fit neatly into our idea of what's possible. I've thought about that day 1,000 times since then. I've read all the Bigfoot theories, the debunkings, the scientific explanations. None of them quite explain what happened to us. None of them explain the fear in Uncle Mike's eyes, or why those tracks were laid out in that perfect omega pattern. Sometimes I dream about those tracks in the snow, following them to where they disappear into the trees. In the dreams, I always lift up a pair of binoculars and look into the forest, but I always wake up before I see what's looking back at me. I still have Uncle Mike's binoculars. They're in my closet, in their original case. I've never used them. Sometimes I think about taking them out, maybe even returning to Vasquez Creek to look for myself. But then I remember Uncle Mike's face that day, the terror, the certainty of what he'd seen, and I put the thought away. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some patterns in the snow aren't meant to be followed. Story 13. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 8 months now, debating whether to share it. Part of me worried nobody would believe me. and another part just wanted to forget it happened, but I can't shake it, and I need to get this off my chest. I grew up in Safford, Arizona, right at the base of Mount Graham. That mountain was practically my backyard for 18 years before I joined the army and moved away. I spent 13 years in the infantry, deployed 3 times, and have been in some genuinely terrifying situations. I've heard all kinds of sounds in the wilderness, across multiple continents. What I heard that night on Mount Graham wasn't any of them. This past April, I took 2 weeks of leave to visit my hometown. I hadn't been back in almost 3 years, and some of my old high school buddies planned a camping trip like we used to do as teenagers. There were 6 of us: me, Tyler, Mike, Dave, Chris, and Ryan. We've all known each other since middle school, and even though we've gone our separate ways, we still keep in touch. We decided to camp at this spot we used to go to as kids, about 9 miles up the mountain on an old logging road. It's not an official campsite, just a clearing we found years ago that became our spot. You have to know it's there to find it, which is why we liked it. No crowds, no rangers, just us. The day started normal enough. We all met at Tyler's place around noon on Saturday, loaded up our trucks with gear, and headed up the mountain. The weather was perfect, around 70 degrees during the day, probably dropping to the 40s at night. We got to the spot around 3 in the afternoon, set up our tents, collected firewood, and cracked open some beers. After cooking some burgers for dinner, we sat around the fire, catching up and reminiscing. Mike brought his guitar, and we were just having a good time. Nothing felt off or strange. The fire was going strong, we were all a few beers in, and everything felt exactly like it used to when we were younger. It was around 1 in the morning when things changed. We were still up, not even close to, calling it a night, when this sound came from somewhere in the forest behind our camp. I've tried to describe it to people since then, and I always struggle. It wasn't a coyote, though we have plenty of those in the area. It wasn't an elk bugle or a mountain lion's scream, both of which I've heard countless times. It started as this deep, drawn-out howl that seemed to vibrate the air, but then it morphed into something else. This guttural, almost angry vocalization that made the hair on my arms stand up. The sound lasted maybe 7 or 8 seconds, and it was loud enough that we all immediately stopped talking. "What the fuck was that?" Chris asked, staring into the darkness beyond our campfire. Nobody answered right away. We all just looked at each other, and I could tell everyone was mentally going through the list of animals it could have been, just like I was. "Probably just a coyote with something wrong with it," I finally said, though I didn't believe it. I've heard sick and injured animals before. This wasn't that. "Yeah, maybe," Tyler agreed, but I could tell he was just trying to ease the tension. We laughed it off, tried to go back to our conversations, but things felt different. We were all listening now, paying more attention to the darkness beyond our circle of light. Mike put the guitar away. We started talking in lower voices, even though that makes no logical sense. About 45 minutes later, maybe around 2:15, we heard it again. This time, it was much closer, maybe 100 yards from camp, and it sounded angry. That's the only way I can describe it. The howl had this furious quality to it, like whatever was making it was pissed off. Before any of us could say anything, we heard movement. Not just walking through leaves, but serious movement. Branches snapping, brush being pushed aside with force. Whatever was out there was big, and it wasn't alone. There were multiple sources of sound, moving in what seemed like a semicircle behind our camp. I'll never forget the sound of this one branch breaking. It wasn't a twig or a small limb. It sounded like someone snapped a baseball bat in half with no effort. Just crack. Sudden and violent. Dave stood up without saying a word, walked to his truck, which was parked maybe 20 feet from our fire, got in and turned on the headlights, pointing them toward where the sounds were coming from. The second those lights came on, everything stopped. The movement, the breaking branches, complete silence fell over the forest. We all sat frozen, staring into the tree line, looking for any sign of movement or reflection of eyes in the light. Nothing. For what felt like an eternity but was probably 5 minutes, we just sat there, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no nightbirds, nothing. "I'm sleeping in my truck tonight," Ryan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. One by one, we all agreed. None of us had ever done that before. We've camped through thunderstorms, snowstorms, had bears wander near our campsite, all kinds of situations where normal people might get spooked. But we'd always toughed it out in our tents. Not that night. I grabbed my sleeping bag from my tent and climbed into the back seat of Mike's truck. Chris joined me while Mike took the front. The others split between Dave's and Tyler's vehicles. We locked the doors, another first for our camping trips. I don't think any of us slept much. I know I didn't. I kept listening for that sound again, or for movement outside, but the rest of the night was completely silent. It was almost worse than hearing something. When the sun came up around 5:30, I finally dozed off for maybe an hour before the heat of the morning sun woke me up. We all emerged from the vehicles looking exhausted and a bit embarrassed. "So we all just slept in our trucks because of a weird noise," Tyler said, trying to laugh it off. "Let's check it. Out," I suggested, pointing to the area where we'd heard the sounds. We walked over to the edge of our clearing and immediately saw evidence that something had definitely been there. Several branches were snapped off trees at about shoulder height. Not broken from the weight of snow or wind, but clearly broken off with force. The breaks were fresh, with sap still oozing. What really got me were 2 branches lying on the ground. These weren't small twigs. One was as thick as my calf, maybe 3 inches in diameter. The other was even bigger, baseball bat-sized. Both had been snapped clean, not torn or twisted like when a branch falls naturally. Whatever did this had serious strength. "Deer can't do this," Mike said, picking up one of the branches. "Neither can a coyote." "Bear, maybe," Ryan suggested, but we all knew better. Bears don't make sounds like what we'd heard, and the branches were broken too high up for a bear on all fours. While we were standing there, Dave said something that made my stomach drop. "You know what that sound reminded me of?" he asked. "I was watching these videos on this Bigfoot website a few months ago, and they had these audio recordings. It sounded exactly like that. Under normal circumstances, we would have laughed at him for even suggesting it. But standing there, looking at branches that would take significant strength to break, remembering that sound that none of us could identify despite our collective decades of outdoor experience." Nobody laughed. We made breakfast in awkward silence, packed up our gear, and were heading down the mountain by 9, much earlier than we'd planned. On the drive back, we tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was other campers messing with us, though we hadn't seen another vehicle on that road. Maybe it was some animal we just weren't familiar with. Maybe the branches had been broken earlier and we just hadn't noticed them when setting up camp. But deep down, I know what I heard wasn't anything normal. I've spent more time in the wilderness than most people. I've heard every animal native to Arizona and plenty from other parts of the world. That sound was something else entirely. I still talk to the guys regularly, but we don't bring up that night much. When we do, it's always brief, like we're all afraid to dig too deep into it. We haven't been camping since, though Tyler mentioned maybe going again next summer. I don't know if I'll join them. What bothers me most isn't the idea that there might be something unexplainable on that mountain. It's that whatever was out there that night seemed angry at our presence. It wasn't just making noise, it was sending a message. And that message was clear. We weren't welcome. I don't have a neat conclusion to this. I don't know what was in those woods that night. But whatever it was big enough and strong enough to snap branches that would take me significant effort to break. And it made a sound I've never heard before or since. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear that sound again, even though I'm now 2,000 miles away from Mount Graham. And in those moments, I'm right back there, staring into the darkness, wondering what was staring back at us. Story 14. I've been holding this in for a long time. 24 years to be exact. I've never told anyone about what happened that morning because I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention. But after all this time, I think I'm finally ready to share my experience. It was early May of 1999. I remember because the trees were just starting to bud and there was that fresh smell of spring in the air that comes after a long Michigan winter. I lived in Thompsonville back then, still do actually, a tiny place in the northern Lower Peninsula where everyone knows everyone. That morning started like any other. I woke up around 6, made some coffee and got dressed for my usual walk. My dad was a logger and I grew up spending most of my time outdoors. The woods never scared me. They were like a second home, a place where I felt comfortable and at peace. I headed out on this old 2-track path not far from my house. It's a route I'd walked hundreds of times before. The path winds through a mix of forest and swampland that not many people venture into. The morning was cool, but not cold, probably around 50 degrees, with a light mist hanging over the ground. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees. About 20 minutes into my walk, I heard something moving through the underbrush. This wasn't unusual. I'd seen plenty of deer, raccoons, and even the occasional black bear over the years. When you grow up in the UP wilderness like I did, wildlife encounters are just part of daily life. I stopped walking and listened, trying to figure out what kind of animal it might be. Whatever it was moving fast, really fast. The sound was coming from deeper in the woods to my right. I could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling, but the sound wasn't quite right for a deer. It was heavier, more purposeful, and then I saw it. About 50 yards away, a large figure emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees. My first impression was that it was wearing white, but as I focused, I realized that wasn't quite right. It wasn't wearing anything, it was just white or grayish white. The color stood out starkly against the green and brown backdrop of the forest. What struck me immediately was its size. I own horses, and this thing was at least as tall as my largest gelding, maybe 7 feet high. But it wasn't a horse, it was moving on 2 legs, not 4. And the speed, God, the speed. I've seen deer sprint and bears run when they're scared, but this thing moved faster than anything I've ever witnessed in these woods. Its stride was enormous, covering ground in long, fluid movements that seemed impossible for its size. I stood completely still, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. It hadn't noticed me yet, and I wanted to keep it that way. It was moving parallel to the path I was on, heading in the same direction I'd been walking. What amazed me was how effortlessly it navigated the terrain. That part of the woods has a lot of fallen trees and swampy patches that are difficult to cross. I've spent my whole life in these forests and still have to carefully pick my way through certain areas, but this thing just flowed over and around obstacles like they weren't even there. At one point, it leaped over a fallen oak that had to be at least 4 feet high, clearing it with room to spare. The jump was so smooth, so graceful, not what you'd expect from something so large. It never turned to look at me, just continued on its way through the woods until I couldn't see it anymore. The entire sighting probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt much longer. I stood frozen in place for several minutes after it disappeared, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, my first instinct was to follow it. Looking back, that was probably stupid, but curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously moved in the direction it had gone, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I didn't see the creature again, but what I did find sent a chill through me. In a muddy patch near where I'd last seen it, there were footprints, if you could call them that. They were huge, easily 18 inches long and deeply pressed into the mud. Whatever had made them was heavy. The prints weren't like anything I recognized. They weren't bear tracks, which I know well. These were elongated, almost human-shaped, but much larger and with different proportions. I wish I'd had a camera with me, but this was 1999, and people didn't carry phones with cameras everywhere like they do now. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they eventually disappeared into rockier ground where they didn't leave impressions. I spent another hour searching the area, but found nothing else. When I got home, I was shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the adrenaline rush and the feeling that I'd witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not my friends, no one. It seemed too unbelievable, and I couldn't bear the thought of people laughing at me or thinking I was making it up. 2 days later, I was driving to work with the radio on when I heard something that made me nearly drive off the road. The DJ was talking about a Bigfoot sighting that had been reported on the same highway, not far from where I'd been walking. He was laughing about it, making jokes about people drinking too much or having overactive imaginations. That's when I knew for certain I would keep my experience to myself. If that's how they treated someone else who reported something similar, I wanted no part of it. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a person in some kind of suit, but no human could move that fast or jump that high. A bear standing on its hind legs. Bears don't run like that, and they're not white or grayish white. Some other animal I'm not familiar with? After growing up as a logger's daughter in Michigan forests, I've seen pretty much every creature that lives in these parts. The thing is, I'm not a person who believes in monsters or supernatural stuff. I've always been practical, grounded in reality. Before that day, if someone had told me they saw Bigfoot, I probably would have been just as skeptical as that radio DJ. But what I saw was real. It moved with purpose and intelligence. It navigated difficult terrain with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity with the forest. And those footprints, they weren't from any animal native to Michigan. I've gone back to that spot many times over the years, hoping to see it again, but also terrified of the possibility. I never have. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if maybe my mind was playing tricks on me that morning. But then I remember those footprints in the mud, and I know what I saw was real. I drive past that spot almost every day, and every time the memory comes back with perfect clarity. The way it moved, the impossible speed, the fluid grace that defied its size. It's like the image is burned into my brain. For 24 years, I've carried this secret knowledge. I've heard other stories over the years, hikers claiming to hear strange noises in the woods, hunters finding unusual tracks. But I've never shared my experience, until now. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I just needed to finally get this off my chest after all these years. Whatever I saw that day in May of 1999, it wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I've ever encountered in my lifetime in these forests. And despite all logic and reason telling me it's impossible, I can only come to one conclusion. I saw Bigfoot, or something like it. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. The worst part isn't the fear or the confusion, it's the not knowing, not having anyone to validate what I experienced. Sometimes I think about those footprints and wish I'd had a way to document them, some kind of proof. But maybe it's better this way. Some things in nature aren't meant to be proven or explained. All I know is that whenever I'm in the woods now, especially alone, I feel like I'm being watched. Not in a threatening way, but like I'm sharing the forest with something ancient and intelligent that chooses to remain hidden. Something that was here long before us and will probably still be here long after we're gone. Story 15. I still get goosebumps when I think about what happened that September evening in '79. I was 14 then, staying with my grandparents in this apartment complex in Red River County, while my parents sorted through some financial troubles back home. It wasn't ideal, but my grandparents were good people, and there was a decent fishing pond across the field that helped pass the time. September 1st was a Saturday. I remember that clearly because I'd been waiting all week to have a full evening to fish without homework hanging over my head. The weather was still hot, that sticky Texas late summer heat that makes your shirt cling to your back within minutes of stepping outside. But I didn't care. Fishing was the one thing that made me feel normal during that weird transitional period of my life. I grabbed my tackle box and fishing rod around 5 in the afternoon. My grandma had made me a sandwich and filled my water bottle. "Be back before dark, Lucas," she'd said, like always. I promised I would, even though I knew the best fishing often happened right when the sun was setting. The pond wasn't anything special, maybe half an acre, surrounded by tall grass and weeds. It was set in this open field across from the apartments, about 200 yards from the nearest building. Not secluded exactly, but far enough that you felt like you had some space to yourself. On the far side, maybe 100 yards beyond the pond, ran a fence line with several cedar trees of different heights. Some were just scraggly bushes, others maybe 15 feet tall. I found my usual spot, a flatter area where I could set up my tackle box without it tipping over. The fishing was good that evening. I'd caught 4 decent-sized perch within the first hour and had them on my stringer in the water. I remember feeling satisfied, thinking about how my grandpa would help me clean them for dinner. It was around 6:30 when things changed. The sun was still up, but starting to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. That's when I got this feeling, like someone had just walked into the room behind me, except I was outside. The hair on my arms stood up. You know that feeling when you just know someone is watching you? It was like that, but amplified by 100. At first I tried to ignore it. I focused on my bobber, telling myself it was nothing, but then I noticed the silence. If you've ever been outdoors in Texas, you know it's never really quiet. There's always something, cicadas buzzing, birds calling, the rustle of small animals in the grass. But everything had just stopped. The only sound was the occasional light splashing of water against the pond's edge. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Animals go quiet for a reason, usually when there's a predator around. I've been in the woods enough with my dad to know that. I slowly turned my head, scanning the area around me. Nothing behind me toward the apartments, nothing to my left or right along the pond's edge. Then I looked across the field toward that fence line with the cedar trees. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just those familiar cedar trees standing along the fence. But as I stared longer, something felt off about one cluster of trees. I squinted, trying to make it out better in the early evening light. That's when one of the trees moved. I froze. My body went cold despite the heat. What I had thought was just another cedar tree separated itself from the others. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and dark brown, almost black. It was covered with what looked like grass and debris, like it had been lying down in the field and stood up with all that stuff still stuck to it. This thing stepped out from among the cedars and moved toward the fence. It stopped beside one of the taller trees, and even from that distance, about 100 yards, I could tell it was watching me. The way it blended with the cedar was uncanny, like it had evolved specifically to hide. Among them, if it hadn't moved, I never would have spotted it. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were filled with concrete. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I just sat there, fishing rod forgotten in my hands, staring back at this thing that was staring at me. We must have stayed like that for at least a minute, though it felt like hours. Then it moved again, not toward me, but shifting its position slightly. That small movement broke whatever spell had paralyzed me. I dropped my fishing rod right there on the ground. I didn't even think about it. Pure instinct took over, and I ran. I abandoned everything. My tackle box, my rod, even the stringer with my caught fish still in the water. I just ran as fast as my legs would carry me toward the chain-link fence that separated the field from the apartment complex. I remember my lungs burning and the sound of my sneakers slapping against the dry grass. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Something deep inside told me that looking back would be the worst thing I could do. I reached the fence and practically threw myself over it, catching my jeans and ripping them, but I didn't care. I kept running until I reached my grandparents' apartment. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my face probably white as a sheet. My grandma was in the kitchen making dinner, and my grandpa was watching TV in his recliner. They both looked at me like I was crazy. "Lucas, what happened?" My grandma rushed over, putting her hands on my shoulders. Between gulps of air, I managed to tell them what I'd seen. I expected them to laugh it off or tell me it was just my imagination, but they didn't. My grandpa turned off the TV and listened intently. My grandma's face grew serious. When I finished, my grandpa nodded slowly. "Where's your fishing gear?" "I left it," I admitted, suddenly feeling foolish despite my fear. "Everything's still there." My grandpa stood up, and for a moment I thought he was going to make me go back for it right then. Instead, he said, "We'll get it in the morning, when it's light." That surprised me. My grandpa was always lecturing me about taking care of my things, especially my fishing gear, which had been a birthday present. For him to leave expensive equipment out overnight meant he was taking what I'd said seriously. My grandma made me sit down and drink some water. Neither of them questioned my story or suggested I was making it up. That was almost scarier than their insistence on waiting until morning to retrieve my stuff. They believed me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure by the cedar tree. I kept imagining it moving closer to the apartments, maybe even looking in through my window. I know that sounds ridiculous now, but at 14, alone in the dark, it felt entirely possible. The next morning after breakfast, my grandpa and I walked back to the pond. It was a bright, sunny day, and in the daylight my fear from the previous evening seemed almost silly. Almost. When we reached the spot where I'd been fishing, I immediately knew something was wrong. My tackle box was several feet from where I'd left it, and it looked like someone, or something, had knocked it around like a toy. The plastic tray that normally sat neatly inside was lying on the ground, hooks and lures scattered everywhere. My fishing rod was untouched, lying exactly where I'd dropped it, but the stringer with my 4 perch was gone. My grandpa walked slowly around the area, looking at the ground. He stopped about 10 feet away and bent down. "Lucas," he called, his voice oddly tight. "Come here." I walked over and saw what he was looking at. There, in the flattened grass, was a single fish head, one of my perch. The rest of the fish, and the stringer itself, were nowhere to be found. My grandpa stood up and scanned the area toward the fence line and cedar trees. His face was grim in a way I'd never seen before. "Let's get your things and go," he said quietly. As we gathered my scattered gear, I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. Between the pond and the fence line where I'd seen the figure, the tall grass was pressed down in a path about 2 feet wide, like something heavy had walked through it recently. On the walk back, my grandpa was unusually quiet. It wasn't until we were almost at the apartments that he finally spoke. "Your dad ever tell you about the time he went hunting with my brother Earl back in '64? I shook my head. "Maybe he will someday," was all my grandpa said. Years later, after my grandpa passed, my dad finally told me that story, and several others. Turns out, our family has a history with whatever watches from the cedar trees in Red River County. Going back generations. I've never been back to that pond. I moved on with my life, grew up, went to college, got a job. But I've never forgotten what I saw that evening, and I've never fished alone since then. Some people call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch or a dozen other names. I don't know what it was. All I know is that something watched me from those cedar trees that September evening. Something that could stand perfectly still and blend in with its surroundings until you couldn't tell where the trees ended and it began. Something that took interest in a 14-year-old boy fishing alone by a pond. And sometimes, even now, when I'm outdoors and the birds suddenly go quiet, I get that same feeling crawling up my spine, and I know it's time to leave. Story 16. I've been hesitating to write this for years. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest before it eats me alive. If you think I'm crazy after reading this, that's fine. 20 years ago, I would have thought I was nuts too. I grew up on a farm in rural North Carolina, about 40 minutes from the nearest town of any real size. Our property had about 80 acres, mostly woods, with some cleared land for crops and the animals. My childhood was pretty normal for a country kid. I spent most of my time outdoors, helping with chores or exploring the woods and creeks that ran through our property. When I was 12, I had this spot I loved down by the creek that ran along the back of our property. It was maybe a quarter-mile from our house, this little clearing where I'd sit on this flat rock and just watch the water or read books. My parents were fine with me going there alone as long as I was back by dinner. I practically lived at that creek during summers. One day in late August, I remember because school was starting the next week, I was sitting at my usual spot. It was late afternoon, maybe around 5, and I was just tossing pebbles into the water. That's when I felt it. That weird feeling when you suddenly realize you're being watched. I looked up across the creek, and there it was, standing between two pine trees about 20 yards away. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, completely covered in this dark, blackish-brown fur. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but no, the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, and it was just standing there, watching me. When our eyes met, God, I still get chills thinking about this. Its eyes were dark but intelligent, not animal eyes. They knew I was looking at them. There was awareness there, recognition. I don't know if it was instinct or just pure terror, but I immediately dropped down and curled into a ball. I didn't scream, I didn't run. I just rolled up as tight as I could and pressed my face against that rock. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could hear blood rushing in my ears, but through that I heard it moving. Heavy footsteps crossing the creek, the splash of water, branches breaking underfoot. I was sure it was coming for me. But then the sounds started moving away. Still I didn't move, not for what felt like forever. I stayed curled up in that ball for over an hour, shaking, crying silently, afraid that if I moved or made a sound, it would come back. When I finally gathered enough courage to lift my head, the woods were silent except for normal forest sounds. It was getting dark by then. I ran all the way home, tripping and stumbling, scratching myself on branches. I burst through our back door sobbing. My dad was at the kitchen table. He took one look at me and knew something was wrong. When I managed to choke out what I'd seen, his face changed. Not like he didn't believe me, like he knew exactly what I was talking about. He called them wood boogers, said they'd been in these woods longer than people had. Then he did something that confused and scared me even more. He made me promise never to tell anyone. Not my friends, not my teachers, not even my mom. He said people wouldn't understand, that they'd think we were crazy. Some things in this world ain't meant to be talked about, Mary, he told me. This is one of them. I never went back to that creek alone again. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear or my imagination, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. Those eyes, they weren't an animal's eyes. Life went on. I grew up, went to college, got my degree in wildlife management. I was good at it. I understood animals, habitats, ecosystems. I knew how to balance human needs with conservation. Eventually, I landed my dream job with the Florida Department of Game and Fish. I was 33, managing controlled hunts in a new wildlife management area along the St. Johns River. I loved that job. It combined everything I was passionate about: being outdoors, protecting wildlife, educating people. Then came that day in November 11 years ago now. We had a controlled hunt going on, about 20 hunters with permits for deer. Standard procedure. I was checking in with hunters throughout the day on my four-wheeler, making sure everyone was following regulations, staying in their designated areas. Around 4 in the afternoon, I got a call on my radio. One of the hunters hadn't checked in at his scheduled time. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes hunters get caught up tracking an animal or just lose track of time. But we always check, just to be safe. The hunter's assigned area was near the river, about 3 miles from our management shed. I took my four-wheeler out to look for him. It had rained the night before, so the ground was soft and muddy, making it easy to follow the tire tracks from his truck to where he'd parked. I found his vehicle empty, his hunting pack still inside. Following protocol, I started calling his name and checking the area in widening circles. Nothing seemed amiss. No signs of an accident or trouble. I decided to check along the riverbank, thinking maybe he'd wandered that way tracking a deer. The St. John's is wide at that point, maybe 100 yards across. The banks are lined with cypress trees and dense undergrowth. I parked my four-wheeler and walked the last 50 yards to the water's edge. That's when I saw it, across the river, partially hidden in the cypress trees. At first, I only noticed movement, something large shifting in the shadows. Then it stepped forward into a patch of sunlight. It was like seeing a ghost from my childhood, but worse, much worse. This creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It had the same general shape as what I'd seen as a kid, but it was broader, more muscular. The fur was the same blackish brown, but matted in places with mud or something else. And its face, God, its face. It was disturbingly human-like, with a pronounced brow and a flat nose, but the proportions were all wrong. Too big, too wide, and it had this shock of matted reddish hair on top of its head. I froze. 21 years had passed since my first encounter, but that primal fear came rushing back instantly. But I wasn't a helpless 12-year-old girl anymore. I was a wildlife officer. I had training. I had a gun. My hand moved to my holster, more out of instinct than any real plan. That's when it saw me. Those eyes, intelligent, aware, locked onto mine across the river. There was recognition there, not of me specifically, but recognition that I was human, that I was different from the deer or wild pigs it might normally see. Then it did something I wasn't prepared for. It opened its mouth and let out a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a growl or a howl. It was a roar, deep and resonating like a lion's, but with this undercurrent that sounded almost human. The sound echoed across the river and seemed to physically hit me. I felt it in my chest. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran back to my four-wheeler, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start it. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified it would somehow cross the river and come after me. I don't think I took a full breath until I was back on the main trail, engine roaring, putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. When I got back to the management shed, the missing hunter was already there. He'd gotten turned around but found his way back on his own. He was fine, apologetic about causing worry. I was still shaking, trying to act normal while checking him in and recording his hunting statistics. I must have looked terrible because he asked if I was okay. Just not feeling well, I lied. Might be coming down with something. I couldn't tell him the truth. I remembered my father's words too well. Some things in this world ain't meant to be talked about. After everyone left that day, I sat in my truck for almost an hour, trying to process what I'd seen. I told myself all the rational explanations, a bear, shadows playing tricks, my imagination fueled by childhood memories. But I knew better. Whatever. I'd seen as a child in North Carolina, I'd just seen its cousin or relative in Florida, 300 miles away. I called in sick the next day, and the next. On the third day, I submitted my resignation. I couldn't go back to those woods. I just couldn't. My supervisor was shocked. I'd always been dedicated to my work, passionate about conservation. He offered me a position at a different management area, but the thought of being alone in any woods made me break out in a cold sweat. A few months later, my father passed away. He left the family farm to me, but I couldn't take it. The thought of living surrounded by those woods, knowing what might be watching from the trees. I signed over my inheritance to my cousin and used what money I had to move to Tampa. I got a job in an office, insurance claims. I hate it, but it's as far from the wilderness as I could get. Sometimes I think about reporting what I saw, but who would believe me? And what good would it do? They're out there, these creatures, and they've managed to stay hidden for centuries. Maybe it's better that way. I still wake up some nights hearing that roar. Those eyes haunt me, intelligent, aware, watching. I haven't set foot in the woods since that day. My life's work, my passion for wildlife and conservation, all of it gone because of what I saw. I don't know what they are. My dad called them wood boogers. Others might call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. All I know is they're real, they're out there, and they've taken everything from me.